variances and rezonings, the potential financial return. But I appreciate the business case that he's made for my rezoning. Please tell me the recorder's not on.
I'll clean that up.
Thanks.
Well, because they never tell me how long it's going to take. I wish this had an auto start, so right at 6:30 it would go, but which it's.
Is that the only one? I haven't checked my non-work email today. Was there anything else on East Bennett?
Nothing else.
Okay. Was there anything? So I think the meeting that I missed was when we had the discussion item on this, right? Because I'd asked about what might happen with the M1 on the other side. Did we have any residents come for the discussion? Or business neighbors? Did Paul or anyone come? Okay.
We elected a new chair at that meeting. No,
Score.
you're not getting out that easy.
We mutinied.
Usually I get volunteered for things when I'm not there, not vice versa.
I think it's always.
You button it right now, approximately.
Hey, Krista.
Zip it.
So Nina, Far, and
Oh, Nina's not here. I saw her last night when I was walking the dog, and I said, "See you tomorrow," and she went, "Yeah, see you tomorrow."
Krista's not here either.
okay, so Nina, Deb, or Kristen, not either.
Do we have a quorum?
Krista? Is her name tag?
She's just not present yet.
Oh, okay.
But she will be.
But yeah, I didn't hear anything from Ian or Kristen not being here.
Woo-hoo.
And our-
Okay.
Can't do anything yet.
Nope. We wait.
All right, I'll find something else.
We could. I would suggest we give it a couple minutes, but if it gets to be 5 minutes after, so then we can open the meeting and just move the discussion items up.
That might be Ian. I saw somebody walk.
It's 6:29. He's not late.
That's Ian. Shoulder bag.
Oh, now you're staring at me.
That's scary.
Well, he's walking like a duck. He must
What
be
else do you
Dan.
know about us?
Yeah, I was about to say.
Can't tell you. No,
I
my
scared
cookies.
one of my trustees of Henry Ford once because I rattled off his home address in front of him because I had used it so often. I worked in the president's office. We mailed them things all the time. And he was more than like a little bit
Oh,
flustered.
Oh, dear.
Are you gonna have a sidekick today, Brett?
oh yeah.
You gotta.
This is my invisible friend.
Got it.
I just realized I don't think I need my computer. I think I need a pen.
You will probably need a computer to look at the FBC ordinance amendment. Of all the things out there,
Somebody's
that's
gonna
pretty harmless. So
hand
just
those
let me
out.
have it.
Or you already have it, possibly.
Brent, say your last name for me.
Goering.
Goering.
Gur like a tiger, ink like a pen.
Because I always say it wrong.
Yep. See?
I always
like
say it
that
with an
little mnemonic
ing at
device.
the end.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty handy.
Yeah. It's memorable.
Just take the E out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're good.
Just didn't know you were killing trees out there today.
I didn't used to, but I've had so much trouble printing my site plans to jam up my printer because they are different sizes and it can't read it.
For sure. This is actually not the agenda.
My eyes are getting older, so I need my site plans.
We're going to need it.
All right, we'll take a minute to get settled in. Open up the meeting. All right. We will call the Planning Commission meeting of Wednesday, September 6, 2017 to order at 6:32 p.m. And we will begin with a roll call. The clerk is ready.
Commissioners Goering,
Here.
Azar,
Here.
Martin,
Here.
Brazen, Williamson,
Here.
Barr, Baker,
Here.
Casio,
Here.
and Kelly.
Commissioners Brazen, Farr, and Kelly did notify us that they would not be in attendance. Is there a motion to excuse their absences?
I move to excuse the commissioners.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. That was a motion by Commissioner Azar with a second by Commissioner Goering. All in favor?
Aye.
And we will move to the approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or changes to this evening's agenda?
I move that we approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
Thank you. That's a motion to approve the agenda from Councilman Martin with a second from Commissioner Azar. All in favor?
Aye.
Any objections? Thank you. That motion passes as well. First, we will begin with a call to audience. This is a time when the audience can address the Planning Commission on anything that's not on the agenda tonight. So the items on the agenda, there will be time for audience questions or comments when we get to them. But if there's anyone in the audience who wants to address us on anything not on the agenda, you can come to the podium and state your name, and you've got 3 minutes to address the Planning Commission. All right, we'll move on then to our first item, our public hearing. A public hearing is a time for the public to share thoughts on a specific topic, in this case, the R3 rezoning on East Bennett Street. You share your thoughts with the Planning Commission. We will begin with a presentation from the city staff. After that, I will open the public hearing, and then any members of the public who want to comment can come up to the podium. You've got 3 minutes to comment, direct your comments to the Planning Commission. After we've taken all of the public comments, we've got one email here as well to enter into public comment. We'll close the public hearing, and then we will address questions, whether we got questions from the public or if there are questions up here. We'll deliberate on the issue as a body. So we'll start with the introduction from the city staff.
Thank you. So I'll just give a brief overview. But so obviously we passed the master plan earlier this year. Things are changing, trying to align with goals and objectives from the plan and recommendations from that plan. So one of those has been looking at rezonings where it makes sense. So essentially the process for rezoning with a zoning map amendment, the Planning Commission does review and either recommend or not recommend, and then that item would be then reviewed by the City Council for their final approval at a later meeting, public hearings at both meetings. This meeting in particular was noticed to 15 property owners, occupants on East Bennett. So the proposal is to rezone the district there from R1 single family to R3 single/multiple family residential. It's kind of been an area that we've been talking about a lot over the past couple of years, primarily regarding the commercial district just to the south along 8 Mile, with some new uses going in and some past rezonings there. Throughout the master plan, we elected just to designate it as commercial/office because it was still kind of, I think, in flux and didn't really have solid direction there yet. Things weren't quite as clear there as they are in some of the other districts in the city, I would say. So it remained in that office service is the current zoning district there. But what we had recommended throughout the master plan were more of these transition areas where you could allow for different housing types. And a lot of different areas, particularly earlier this year, we rezoned some R1 areas that were adjacent to some M1 and I-696 area, the service drive there, to R3 to provide sort of a transition from some of those other commercial areas and industrial areas. So in speaking last month, we had a discussion item that was focused on potentially rezoning and putting a multiple family dwelling of a lower density type, I would say, or medium density on East Bennett Street. That would require rezoning. And then as we discussed that item, it seemed that it might make sense to just rezone the entire street, which would be 15 parcels there on the southwestern or southeastern edge of the city. So in your packet, there's just the background information on rezoning criteria and what that would mean. So right now in the district there's some vacant properties, but there's also some existing single-family homes there. Those properties would be permitted because we did update the R3 zoning district earlier this year that made R1 single-family homes existing or permitted uses there. So it doesn't mean that by zoning at R3 it could be all multiple family. It could be a mixture. So it really just depends what's proposed there going forward. But essentially, R3 is different than R4 in that it is intended to be a little bit lower density than R4 that we have in some of the other portions of the city. And it's meant to be, it's described in the ordinance as a zone of transition for other districts, here being industrial nearby, Hazel Park to the east, and then the commercial district to the south. So here to happy answer any questions. As I mentioned, there was one letter that came in today, and then there was one phone call. I wasn't given an address, and it wasn't for or against, just wanted a clarification and an understanding of the rezoning. So.
All right. Thank you. With that, we will open the public hearing at 6:37-ish, 38. It's hard to tell.
No, you're right.
There's a glare on the clock. And this would be the time for anyone in the audience who wanted to address the Planning Commission on this rezoning topic to come up to the podium. You can give us questions, comments, whatever you'd like for 3 minutes. If you would state your name and address for the record, and we'll take all the questions and comments, then we'll close the public hearing, and then we'll work with city staff to get answers to those, and we'll deliberate up here too. So welcome.
Hi, my name is Carla James. I live at 1521 East Bennett.
Welcome.
So I live right next door to where they're proposing to make these changes. And I've looked online at some of the proposed models, I guess, of workups. And I guess my concern is, this is a quiet neighborhood area. It's, and I feel like it's a relatively small space to put that many people. And I'm just concerned about parking, about the, amount of people that it's going to bring into that area, into that small area, and how it's going to affect the community. In one of the site plans that I looked at, like where the proposed dumpster is like at my backyard, at my fence line. So I just have overall concerns about them rezoning it as that. I didn't purchase my home with the intent of being in the middle of an apartment community or a condo community. I wanted to be in a single family and home environment. That's where I purchased my home. I've been there for 6 years, and I just am not in favor of them rezoning it in this way. It's not a really, from what I'm looking at in the plans, it's not a very big parcel of land, and to put, they're wanting to, it looks like 2 4-unit structure buildings there. It would be getting really close. I mean, it would be right on the edge of my property line, and so just have overall concerns about them rezoning it as such.
Thank you. Is there anyone else to speak on this topic? We will close the public hearing at 6:41. We also had an email that was on the table under your agendas. Wanted to make sure everyone found that, from Mr. Johnson, who it looks like is the person who owns the property and is then unsurprisingly in favor of the rezoning. But he did send this in and ask that it be entered into the record, which Justin has, and it has been shared here. So my first question, Justin, is I missed our last meeting, and I know that there was a discussion item about a specific project. Were any of these questions about parking and the impact on the neighborhood, things like dumpster location, which are certainly things that we look at when we have a formal site plan? So when it comes to screening from adjacent properties and these property line concerns, when you begin to get things close together, did any of those come up in discussion
Yes.
at the last meeting?
Yes, dumpster was definitely brought up. The plan, what's proposed in the plan right now would have to be at least 20 feet from the adjacent R1 district. So that would be certainly fixed. The site did.
So the concept drawing that was out
Yes.
there not only is it not a site plan, it wasn't even in conformance with our
Right.
existing codes.
It was right on for most of it, I would say, but that was one thing that would have to be addressed. It did have enough parking by ordinance. Some of it was internal to the site, some of it was surface parking.
But we weren't counting on-street parking.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yep.
And we did tell them to move the dumpster.
Yes. Yeah. The planning commission brought that up, so that was early on.
I know that's
discussion.
something we always look at. So
Yes.
I wasn't here, but I had a sixth sense. So when you, this isn't necessarily a different use abutting. You know, it's in our district abutting in our district. But was there any discussion of screening or barriers or how sort of Carla's house would be, separated from this neighboring building, from car lights, from the
Sure.
sound of
Yes. So for any multiple family development, we require a screen wall. There's a
Which is
rain.
brick usually.
Yes, concrete, masonry, brick. The landscape requirements as well, and then all the parking required on site. Trying to think of what other things we covered off in that meeting, but all the usual suspects as far as site plan reviews go, and screening, lighting. All the lighting would have to be directed downward, have to conform to the city ordinance. There's a max height on pole lights and things like that, which I don't think was proposed, but all the specific numbers of trees and shrubbery. The facade was, I think, in close alignment with what the neighborhood compatibility would be.
That's helpful. I mean,
Yeah.
we're not considering a specific site plan, but because that is part of the context in which this discussion is happening, I
Yep.
wanted to make sure we were all up to speed in case anyone else missed the last meeting.
Absolutely, and they would have to submit an official, formal site plan, and that would be approved by Planning Commission and reviewed by staff. So that's by no means done, or the plan was concept as you mentioned.
Okay. So then, if and when that comes back to the city staff, then you would have things like parking and traffic circulation, dumpster location, sight and sound screening, and property line issues. Those are all on your radar, either from the prior discussion or from the comments that
Yep.
we just had.
Stormwater retention, all of those types of things.
If I can just add on to that point in question, I don't know if notification is required in that instance, but can we make a note to contact the resident if we get to the point, the site plan, so she knows when
Yeah.
a discussion occurs?
Absolutely.
Yep, 1521 East Bennett. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so then in general, on the rezoning, so there was a comment about the environment and the predominantly single-family environment, and that wouldn't necessarily change immediately, nor would it be forced to change. There used to be a mismatch between R1 and R3, where if we zoned up to R1, that made your single-family home now non-conforming in this zone. So if you had a catastrophe, a fire or something, and you wanted to rebuild, you wouldn't have been able to. That's not the case anymore. So not only are these homes permitted, but frankly, you could build new ones. So if
Correct.
this
Yep.
developer said, well, forget it, I don't want to do an apartment building, I want to do 3 more houses, you could. If something substantially damaged your home, you can rebuild your home, no problem,
Right.
at least in zoning. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of that neighborhood now as we turn to the question of potentially rezoning to R3. So looking to the commission for comments on the changes that would bring. Commissioner Williamson?
Well, I mean, we do have a residential district here that's butting right up against. Is this office at this point that's right below it? I
Yeah,
can't remember if
a
we-
mishmash office service and some
Right, we
mixed-
didn't end up rezoning that, it's still office, but there's even some industrial use there, if I recall correctly, with a stamping plan in one of these buildings. And then there's a larger public storage facility that's proposed to go in on the end there up next to the rail track, which I think it's a positive thing to see some increased interest in reusing some of these buildings that have long been vacant. At the same time, I do think we need to think about transitioning from this office district into a residential district, and it's a little abrupt to have it jump right from an office directly to an R1. An R3 district doesn't necessarily have to mean that there are going to be substantial changes. I live in an R3 district myself. It's largely single family. There are a couple of other slightly larger residential developments in my district, but the way Ferndale tends to develop, I don't see it being a substantial change in character. Through the chair, Justin, do you recall the number of, for this district, for the development that's actually been proposed, do you recall the number of parcels that would be encompassed by that development?
It's two. One of them's larger than the other. I think some of these sites here are they're not very large lots. So I think it's 2 to 2.5. There's one portion that's vacant, and then there's one parcel that I think has a garage standing from a previous home on it.
Okay, thank you. And if I recall correctly, there are a number of newly built, very large homes on this strip here with garages that face right up to the street. With that being where the neighborhood is right now, my feeling is this is not going to be something that's going to substantially change the character of the neighborhood.
If I may, through the chair, I'd like to agree. I think this is a transition that makes sense, particularly when you look at the nature of the neighborhood now. With what's there, nobody's going to go through and knock down these new single-family homes to throw up apartment complexes. I mean, this is slightly different with what's being proposed, but I don't see it as egregious. I don't see, like, for example, the parking, meets the ordinance requirements. I do think this body has to be diligent for the existing residents of that street, just as we were when they came with the concept design, and as we will when we see a site plan, to make sure that we're not imposing on neighboring neighborhoods. And I feel comfortable that we have the outlines and the rules in place and the governance of the Planning Commission to be able to do that and still make this an R3 and have a transition there that makes sense. And I don't think it will dramatically change the character of the neighborhood, but we do have to be vigilant for the existing neighbors, and I think this allows us to do that.
Other comments on the zoning change itself and the appropriateness of that district? Is anyone ready to make a motion?
Sure, I would move that the Planning Commission recommend approval of the zoning map amendments to rezone the parcels listed below from R1 single family to R3 single multiple family to City Council with the findings that are listed in the packet.
Support.
Thank you. That is a motion made by Councilman Martin with a second by Commissioner Williamson, and we will do a roll call vote on this one.
Commissioner Cesar?
Yes.
Let's go down here a second. Baker?
Yes.
Cassidy?
Yes.
Gurink?
Yes.
Martin?
Yes.
Williamson.
Yes.
And if I may, through the chair, I just
Thank you. The motion passes.
I would just want to remind, if we can make sure we notify residents when the site plan comes, that we make sure we have that discussion and encourage the developer to talk to the neighbors. I know he's a neighbor himself, but let's make sure, if we can encourage that conversation.
Absolutely. And I believe he, in his discussions with him today, he had spoken to a couple, and then he said he would go forth with the rest of the neighborhood. So definitely keep encouraging that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. We We'll move to item number 5A, discussion item on 482 West 8 Mile Road. This is a special land use discussion. We'll have this introduced by city staff. We only have 2 pages on this? Yeah, we only have 2 pages.
Yes.
That's right, because I have a question about site orientation.
And I don't see Mike. So the applicant actually did have a death in the family last week, so he mentioned he may not be able to make it, but we've been talking about this for a number of months, so I said I would introduce it at least and get some initial feedback from the commission. So the business owner, he's owned, actually he's representing the owner of Atlas Tire and Lube, which is on 500 West 8 Mile Road, essentially Edgewood and 8 Mile. He's had that business for a number of years, and he recently acquired the property just east, so that's 482 West 8 Mile Road, so opposite corner of his current business. The property is zoned mixed use 2. There's C2 adjacent to the west, mixed use 2 to the east, and then R2 to the north and northwest. The use is permitted as vehicle repair minor in the district, but as a special land use. So we've been talking quite a bit over the past few months about parking, building orientation. It's kind of a challenging site for all of the requirements that go with vehicle repair minor. So we've looked at a number of different concept options. I think this is probably the closest we've come, but that also, I also informed the applicant, I think there's probably some things we could improve upon, and I believe right now he has excess parking of what the ordinance requires, so I would just want to be sure. I would have to double check and make sure that's not over the 10% that is allowed to overpark, I guess. But we've been talking about a concept plan. He's really excited. He's kind of been in a dilapidated older building for quite some time. This would be a big improvement to his business, but wanted to come talk with you before public hearing notices and site plan were sent out for a special land use application.
So is he vacating the building across the street? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure. Is the applicant in the audience? We did just have someone walk in. I want to be sure because it's not you. Okay.
No.
And was there anyone who had a question on this project before we move forward? Sure. Come on. No. No, different. This one is on the other side of town. Excuse me. I wanted to make sure we didn't have anyone in the audience who was specifically had a question about this one at 8 Edgewood.
Thanks.
Yes,
Sorry.
Councilman. Yep.
So is the intent of the owner to move out of the existing space across the street then?
Correct.
He's not going to run 2 auto shops or something like that?
Not at least in the most recent plans, no.
All right, and on the site plan, it shows an adjacent building. What is that adjacent building right now?
I believe it's Globe Slicing.
Globe Slicing.
Okay.
So I had a couple of questions that you actually must have already had a conversation about, so I'm really interested into why the building is oriented this way. What in the world?
well-
I mean, I think about what we just did with Kitchen Concepts, for example,
Yes.
in terms of another site that needed parking, was relatively narrow, but they still made great efforts to orient it toward its address.
Sure.
This is specifically against our ordinance.
Yeah, we've looked at a number of options, and I think we came to an impasse where we said let's at least get some more feedback from others besides me. So we've had a number of layouts. Initially, the applicant wanted the building to go entirely woodward, 8 Mile frontage, and have the parking bays come off 8 Mile, which I said that would be kind of a giant curb cut, pretty dangerous for everyone involved. I don't even think it would be permitted by ordinance. We did pull the building
Which
close.
is basically what he's got now, I believe. I mean, right now all of his bays face 8 Mile.
Right. Yeah, the existing facility is set up that way. He flipped a number of options. I encouraged him to put the office area closest to 8 Mile. Being that it's a corner site, it's sort of challenging. We looked at an L-shaped building option, which may be what is best. But there were a number of options that we looked at. So this is the closest that I think we came. But not saying it couldn't be improved upon.
Before I dive into curb cuts, anyone have any other questions on building orientation or facades or? What would the facade that's fronting 8 Mile, what would actually front 8 Mile? Is it a blank wall? Is it an address? Is it,
So to say, I guess to save money from going back to the architect again, I recommend, so you can see there's sort of some frames, I think, for either stock rooms or restrooms there.
which typically don't have windows?
Right. So I had said, automatically from the get-go, we would need that to be completely glass. That could be a lobby area potentially. That would be much more amenable than a blank wall. So
A blank wall, for me at least, would not be acceptable. This orientation, I really need to be convinced as to why there's a safety or other practical reason to make an exception this big. I don't know if anyone else feels as strongly about the building siting.
I just don't know from a visibility perspective that people are going to get. That's what his business is. No, I mean, that's not my consideration. It's his business plan he's got to worry about. But if it doesn't look like a garage from 8 Mile, I don't see it. I see him missing stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a because of the program that he couldn't take this site and turn it 90 degrees clockwise here. If you, or rather, I guess you'd have to turn it and then maybe flip it or something. But is it because of car turn radiuses that they couldn't be entering from 8 Mile and then basically do a complete 180 into a garage?
from 8 Mile into a garage.
Yeah, what were your safety thoughts? So on the ingress from 8 Mile, you had a gut instinct that said that's a giant curb cut and sounds like a safety issue, and Krista shook her head.
Yeah,
So-
well, I think
the building would be right up against
Right.
8 Mile, wouldn't be,
right.
there would be
Back.
no setback.
Right.
So
Yeah, so there's setback requirements for mixed use as well that would need it to be as close to 8 Mile
As
as
close to
possible.
lot line as.
Yeah. And I think the previous iteration had the garage doors like right on 8 Mile, which I said, that's just not gonna work.
But through the chair, were you discussing having the entrance into the garages from the north, where you pull in from 8 Mile but enter the garages from the north? Is that what you're discussing?
Yes, that's what I was suggesting.
Is that an option that had been discussed?
We didn't get to
Instead
that
of
option.
the stalls opening to the south, they open to the north.
I had the concern I guess that I had initially too was the closer the garage doors get to the rear, the closer they are to an R2 district too, which this configuration still, that would be an issue there too. But I initially was directing them that if the building was north-south, then most of the noise would probably face to the west, but I could see a drive as well being an option.
The noise issue is definitely something to consider.
Yeah, now I understand what you guys are talking about. It's sort of pull past it
Yeah, you would go
And
up
pull
and
in.
around.
and then effectively exit to 8 Mile.
I mean,
rather than enter.
then what do you do, I suppose, with a long... I mean, now this wall has no articulation either, so... I don't know
Along
what
8
you would-
Mile?
Yeah.
It's just got roll-up
Again,
doors.
it would... Well, the roll-up doors would be in the back,
But
right?
you'd have to exit too. I mean, if you pulled straight through,
Oh,
if you entered here and exited here, because if you've got a queue now, it's coming behind.
That's a tough one.
Is this, well, now here's the question. Is this a service station in terms of their business plan where you have cars queuing, or is this something where you drop off the car, they pull it in and work on it, and then pull it back out? So is this like a Jiffy Lube or an O'Brien's?
It's more of, probably more of a Jiffy Lube, I guess.
So cars might queue.
Yeah.
but as it stands, they do not pull through even with this alignment, so
Right.
that wouldn't change if it was aligned the other direction, or it didn't necessarily change.
It's a bell tire.
Yeah.
Through the
Essentially.
chair, Justin, was there any thought to switching the orientation of the building and having cars pull in from the north and then exit from the south exit through the south down onto 8 Mile, like the oil change place over on 9 Mile Road by the tracks. That there
That's
never
what I'm
seems to be any traffic issue for that place, and you've got
Nearly zero lot
cars
line.
lining up back behind, but you still get the frontage on 9 Mile.
I think the only issue that came up with that was setback.
Okay.
If I'm thinking of the same facility.
The one I'm thinking of that's
But-
closest to the tracks is nearly zero lot line, though, isn't it? I mean, it's
Yeah.
got a little bench right in
Is it?
front of it because there's two in a row. So the one that's
Right.
closest to the tracks is pulled much further forward than the one next to it.
Right.
That's closer to the
Yeah,
CVS.
it's the smaller one that I'm talking about, the one that's pulled right up to 9 Mile.
Okay, we can look at that and see.
People come in, enter, you pull your car back up behind the building, and then you pull in from the back. But it's one-way traffic going through them because you never have. It's not like you have 5 cars leaving all at the same time. All of the cars can leave through one curb cut, and it doesn't really get back.
And it can be landscaped out front or something,
Right.
and direct people
The
that
one
way.
on 9 Mile is, yeah. And there's a bench, and I was recently waiting a very long time for a train, so I happened to
Sure.
look at it for a long time.
Sure. Yeah.
And that gets to my question about the curb cut on Edgewood. I wondered why it was needed in this particular configuration. If we did something like you're suggesting, Ian,
It would probably be necessary.
it would probably be necessary.
Yeah.
This configuration was primarily just because of the waste receptacle location, just making it an easy in and out. But
Can you slide this down a little bit? Does the site go straight through to Bennett? There aren't houses behind it, are there?
There are none. No.
right.
I thought so. This is Bennett, right? Right here?
Yeah.
Okay, I thought so.
Yep.
So you're not necessarily creating a crazy traffic snarl for houses on the south side because there are none at that site. I think you get 2 doors down behind Globe Slicing. You get at least 2 in before you get a house.
Yeah.
Although I don't know what that's on. Is that whole thing MXD2?
Yes.
The block?
Yeah, all the way to Woodward.
But the whole block, both the 8 Mile frontage and the Bennett frontage?
Yes. Yeah.
Any other discussion or comments?
Did you get what you needed, or what do you think that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Through the chair, I would talk to the applicant about ensuring that the screen wall and the landscaping up on the north side of the parcel are, that some thought really goes into that, because you do have houses along the north side of Bennett there that are going to be looking directly at this. So whatever can be done, and right now it's just a bucolic grassy lot. So whatever can be done to minimize the impact of having a nice grassy lot turn into an auto repair shop, I think is going to be better for the residents and really in the applicant's interest as far as being a good neighbor and generating goodwill within that local area.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pulling this further forward on the site will be a benefit for the neighbors on Edgewood too. That's a really good point.
Right.
Great.
It's hard to tell without the full site plan, but I think your neighbors start halfway through the block on Edgewood. I think the site they're on currently is shallower than this one.
That's true, Kate. And then at the same time, if you go to the east on Bennett, I think you've got residential properties on both sides pretty
Yes.
quickly there.
Yes, you do. Yeah, Edgewood starts halfway through. All right.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you. Sorry we couldn't meet the applicant, but I'm sure we will see him at some point soon.
Definitely.
Great. Okay, we'll move to our next discussion item, item B. This is a discussion on an existing project that is looking to have a conversation about a potential change to that project. This is 475, 487, and 493 Withington. A discussion on the Ferndale House Phase 2. We'll
Yep.
start with Justin.
Great. So I will be brief because the applicants are here. So, but as Chair Baker mentioned, this has been a previously approved site plan for essentially phase 2 of the Ferndale House project, facing Withington Street. Contains 3 parcels that were approved for a site plan back in January. The sites are currently zoned R4, nearby some R3 to the north, R4 to the east, which is the Ferndale Housing Commission building, and then Central Business District to the west and south, including phase 1 of the project. The previous plan included 39 units that was actually connected to phase 1 of the project, and phase 1 includes 90 units that's under construction right now, obviously. The applicants provided a concept plan today that they'll take you through on just some initial renderings, but they're interested in potentially rezoning into something. We had a lot of conversations when phase 2 was approved about not preferring to see parked cars, false walls, things like that from Withington. So the applicant wanted to consider, or have you consider potentially rezoning because of some of the setback limitations with the R4 zoning, and being that the future land use map calls for downtown, which designation which closely aligns with the Central Business District plan there, or zoning district there. All of the parking and vehicular access would be behind this building, so essentially between phase 1 and phase 2, all of the parking would be contained behind the building, but also the shared parking agreement that's was previously signed with Ferndale Foods would be part of this as well. So I'll let the applicants get into more of the specifics, but we talked about what a rezoning would entail, parking requirements, and just discussions about the master plan and any changes this would have on phase 1. So here for questions, but I'll let the applicants do most of the talking.
Sure, yeah, we can have the applicants come up and give us an overview of what the changes might be. I'm not sure if we had anyone in the audience with a question on this topic. Not seeing it running. Okay. Come on up. Welcome.
I'm Mark from Design House Architecture. So the big change from what was previously approved to this is the whole first floor before was parking with an access out to Whittington, which is now all the first floor units are 2-story units, which could be condoed. They're nicer. They have ground level access. But by providing the units all the way to the first floor, now we've handled the issues of cars being visible from Withington. So it's strictly from Withington's face is all residential.
So it's not a change necessarily to the footprint of the building. It's more of an internal change to the way that you've structured the units.
Correct. We did make the building wider. It did get wider. It was a 20-foot side setback before, and now we're 10 with the CBD zoning, which allowed us to reconfigure some stuff like the trash enclosure. It used to be on the east property line. Now it's kind of in that corner there. And it allowed us to rearrange some parking in phase 1 to get that denser by routing that traffic a little bit differently based on this revised footprint of the building. You can see there's 6 garages there, which are they're tandem park garages, so we get 12 spots there, and those go to the 6 2-story units on the first floor. So those are very nice units that we'd have there for those. It's still 4 stories, still, as you can see from the renderings, it's still the same intent and concept that was originally approved, but that bridge connection piece is now eliminated. The materials we could tweak a little bit or whatever.
The buildings aren't connected internally?
No. So there's an aerial of the two. So we used to have a connector piece here, that connected them, and they were a bunch more smaller units, and now because we got the extra square footage on the first floor, now we're getting into a little bit nicer units in size, getting the 2-story spaces as well.
That's a really helpful clarification. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So those are the main things. Like what Justin was saying, we're not increasing the unit count. Actually, with the 2-story units, we're actually decreasing the count from 39 to 33, which helps with the parking concerns and issues.
But you're increasing the price point on the nicer 2-story units, right?
Correct. Yeah. And there's a possibility that those are actual condos rather than rental units, just because of the value of them. That there would be a demand for that. But those are the main changes from the initial approval.
Seeing the pictures makes it so much clearer. Thank you.
Mhm.
We just had a multi-month conversation about townhomes in a different neighborhood, and so when I saw that word in Justin's overview, the first thing I pictured was, are they putting something on the front of the building? Like, I couldn't get it, but thank you.
No, I meant the feel of the building's still the same. It's just
Yep.
those first floor units kind of have that New York, Chicago style, like access from the road ability.
Are you thinking that you would want to do anything penthouse type above it? Is there any reason to have a conversation about height changes between R4 CBD?
Right now, there is no intent to do a penthouse. There would be possibly a roof deck for like a pet, exercise area or something along those lines. It would be like a single access point. It wouldn't be like each unit has their own access.
Okay.
But that'd be the only intent to use the roof would be for something like that.
So no additional structures.
No.
Questions on the rezoning? Well, or I guess, were there any other clarifications or anything on the?
I'd just like to say that's
Updates
a
to the
lot better
building.
than what you brought before.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Through the chair, what would be what would the side setback be with your new proposal as opposed to the previous proposal? You mentioned it was going to be bumped out a little on the sides, but what were you talking about square footage wise?
We're 10 foot now compared to 20 foot before. The CBD gives a 0 setback, but we don't want to get into the fire ratings. So if we stay 10 foot off those lines, it makes the ease of construction a lot easier, not having to fire rate all those walls. Because we lose the windows and all that, which everyone wants the windows. So.
Would your front setback remain the same as it was with the previous proposal?
No, we are a little bit tighter. We're 15 feet right now instead of 25 that it was before.
Do you know what the setback is for the large property that was directly to the east?
The housing commission. I'm not.
Yeah.
Are you asking where the building currently sits?
Yeah.
Or
Do you know
what
what the front setback is for the housing commission building?
It's more than that only because of the circle
It's
drive
got a
runs.
driveway in the front.
It's
Yeah.
got a circle drive.
That's right. Okay.
Are you comfortable, if I'm reading this right, you're actually losing height potential? Are you guys comfortable with that? That you would have a
Where
max height potential in R4 of 60 and now you're going on to 45? Am I reading that right, Justin?
Correct.
You guys are okay with
Yep.
that?
Okay.
If I could, through the chair, do you know what the setback is for the house immediately to the east?
That's the housing commission.
Oh, that's
The housing commission.
sorry. Just kidding. Is there housing immediately to the west then?
That
No,
is
to the
no
west
more
is a
single
funeral
families.
home. So that's
Okay.
a parking lot directly to the west of that,
Okay.
and then Ferndale Foods.
Justin, is there an approved site plan on this? Would we need to do an update to that?
It was
I don't remember if we approved it or not.
approved.
Thank you.
So it'd be a revision and a rezoning. I'd have to look at. I mean, it would be 2 motions.
And both would come back here, we'd see a site plan for an update, or you do that administratively? I mean, what are you?
No, it would come back here.
As part of the rezoning. That was going to be my
Yep.
request, was that we see it as a package. That's helpful.
Mhm.
We talked about the many different types of uses that are allowed in CBD, and I realize that the current intent, aligns with this picture and with this plan, but a rezoning of a parcel this large, if for some reason the project didn't go forward, or the developer, in a couple years market conditions change and they want to build something else in CBD, are you recommending just a conditional rezoning or a straight rezoning to CBD, or
I think conditional would make sense.
any conversation from the commission on?
I would almost insist on a conditional
Yeah,
rezoning.
I'm not comfortable with rezoning it to CBD without,
I don't think I'm comfortable with retail in this block.
No, not at all. This project, absolutely, and that's why I think we do the conditional.
Commissioner Azar?
I agree. And that was in the recommendation, so I just thought it was part of.
Oh, I missed it. This is what happens when I talk on the phone to Justin. I don't read all the details.
I guess the question is, what control would we have over if it's accessed off of Withington or off of the 9 Mile or the backside?
The conditional rezoning could have that
Include something like
stipulation.
that.
This doesn't get it mangled up in the TIF district, does it?
No, it's just outside.
Okay.
Through the chair, Justin, I guess it's down, you're speaking down to 33 units from 39, but it's also a change of a unit type. So as far as the parking requirements, that's still then handled because there's less units. Is that your understanding from the city?
It would actually help the project because the CBD requirements are a little bit less restrictive, I think, than R4.
We would have less of a need for fewer units.
Right.
Right. But the change of unit type has a higher unit requirement, right? The townhouse versus the upper story or the upper level residential.
It would be a combination. So it would be upper level residential and the townhome units.
That's a brain twister in the CBD. Yeah. I can't think of another first-story residential example that we've had to do that calculation for in CBD.
So if this is then a revised site plan, would there be a reduction in the required parking? Or is that going to stay the same regardless of what the actual requirements of the revised site plan would be?
We haven't got that far.
Okay.
But, I think there would be a reduction.
A slight reduction,
Yeah.
And then just for further clarification, because the trash is now moved off of that northern parcel and into the southern parcel, I know you've discussed higher density of the parking in the southern parcel. How does that align? Kind of, looking at the old site plan, this is smack dab in the middle of where everything's kind of circulating through there. So I'm kind of curious how that would actually impact the other site as well as this site.
Yeah, is that in the alley?
Sure. So we got along here where the cars were like half under the building and along that northern property line, if we rotate them perpendicular rather than angled, we're getting more spots per lineal foot of parking. Just that drive lane, the way that worked out, we still have enough width for head-on parking.
So it'd be a center drive lane with parking on that.
It was one-way drive lane before.
Around the outside.
Yeah, so the garbage truck came in, went like that, and then out towards Planavon, where now that would be like a two-way access point. So when I say it gets denser, that's how I mean it's getting denser, is that we're gaining whatever it is. We get a spot every 4 parking spots or something like that.
Right. But there were also parking spots that went west of where the dumpster is now that would also be impacted.
So the dumpster sat like right here,
Okay.
and then it started like to angle in
I
right
thought the
after that.
dumpster was on the northern parcel.
In phase 2's, it was.
Oh, it was a separate dumpster.
So in phase 1, it was on phase 1, and then phase 2's approval, we moved it north
Pulled it
of
north.
that property
Okay.
line into phase 2, and now we've rotated it.
Okay, that clarifies that. Thanks.
I guess in practical terms, as much parking as you can keep on the site, I would be in favor of, as opposed to, you know, because the CBD requirement means you can lose a couple, you know, picking up a few somewhere else. I think it would benefit you to keep as many on site as possible, just in terms of what residents will need. And
No,
want to be
it's
close
our
to.
intent to get that as dense as possible on site to make the residents happier.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? All right. Justin, did you get
That was what I needed.
direction you needed?
Mhm.
All right. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move to our last discussion item, which is C, the downtown design ordinance draft. I look to our city staff and our partners from Safe Built Studio. Is that right? Did I say that wrong? What did I say?
No, you did.
Safe Built
Yeah.
Studio. Oh, Lord.
We don't actually use that term yet, we still use helpful, so.
I didn't entirely understand. You'll have to explain to me what it means.
Yes, so we initially spoke back in June. One of the key action items from the master plan was to take a look at downtown design guidelines, and there was some also mention of exploring form-based code, and just trying to focus more. We've had a lot of developments that it's been great to see active developments and change in the city, but we've also wanted to have a little bit more.
Michelle, do you have one more?
A little bit more say and direction on design and what those
thank
developments look like. So
I had two.
we've been working with Safe Built Studio and Smith Group JJR on what should design guidelines look like, what is appropriate for Ferndale. So we met initially back in June, had a good conversation with some architects and developers that work in the city, and then also Planning Commission, DDA board members, residents, and council members on what does that mean exactly for Ferndale. So we are back with a draft. I will let Michelle Foster of Safe Built Studio talk more about where we landed. We had a good conversation last night initially with the Downtown Design Committee. And I think that was just kind of the first starting point with this draft. And so I anticipate more conversations to come, but we wanted to get this in front of you tonight, especially considering the wave of development that's been happening, and we want to bring our ordinance, I think, up to a more modern state. So,
Thanks, Justin. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to be back. So since Justin teed that up so nicely, and I know that most of you have already been involved, did everyone come to our initial June planning session, the forum?
Where we sat down there?
Yes. Everyone here tonight was there?
I don't think Councilman Martin.
Councilman Martin?
No,
Okay.
I think I was gone now.
Okay, so there's a couple of you. Okay, so then it will
We had a good group.
be thorough. Like Justin said, though, this is kind of it's been a long time coming, but really a product of the master plan process and identifying that we need some better guidelines. Definitely identified before the master plan, but we went from the design guidelines and what's in the existing zoning ordinance, and recently we did the TOD, and then this is kind of like the next iteration of that, putting some more form-based standards towards it. So we did meet in June. I'm sorry that Commissioner Williamson and Councilman Martin were not able to attend, but we did have a good group of people and had a nice discussion to kind of kick this off. And as Justin said, we just met with the design committee yesterday and had some further conversations. So now bringing it to you, and I want to just reiterate that this is in draft form, and I'm sure we'll have multiple edits. And then in the future, if the commission decides to move forward, we'll have a public hearing and move towards adoption and implementation. So I think we all obviously know what's great about Ferndale, but what the form-based code's intentions are to maintain the character and the what's great about Ferndale, and work towards keeping that. And so basically really working off of all the development potential that we have currently, and making sure that we can keep the character of the form that we want and get more out of our zoning ordinance by using this form-based standards. So we all know the goals, pedestrian-oriented. I would add that also includes bike-friendly design, as was reiterated in the design committee last night. Mixed use, context sensitive, maintaining alleyways and parking, and maintaining the character of the downtown. I'll kind of get into this, but when I'll say downtown, but oftentimes that really means the whole TOD area. So if you recall, that includes the CBD as well as all the properties fronting Woodward Avenue. So I say downtown as a very kind of a loose term when we're talking about this whole downtown form-based code.
Could you clarify all the properties fronting Woodward Avenue within what we would consider our downtown boundaries of Camborne and Marshall, or all of the properties fronting Woodward Avenue?
All the properties. The TOD overlay includes from the north to the south border of Ferndale.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about not only how the zoning ordinance maintains and all the standards will direct development, but also the developers do, obviously. You work with them quite often, and you know how it's really a play. When we were talking about Ferndale House earlier, these are the or probably even the better example is how, moving the building for the auto service building, How can we work within our standards to create and maintain the character that we want, and also work with the developer within their constraints? So part of our job and the zoning ordinance's job is to keep those standards and make sure that we're maintaining what's right for Ferndale. So that's our biggest goal. And like I said, the community is the zoning ordinance part kind of this. There's also the market, and then there's some land restrictions, including the natural cultural features, infrastructure, and some community amenities. Your market components include, pricing, funding, community trends. I'm just quickly going over these, but obviously we're going to focus on the zoning regulation as a community part of it. That will also include process, and obviously we've just went through the master plan. We're kind of in the zoning regulation stage now. So with all that, our task is to create these building form standards. Within the ordinance, the draft that you have, we have different building forms. Each of those have a description, the applicability. We'll talk about street frontages, and then what are those building forms going to look like in terms of massing, placement, your access with pedestrian and vehicular, your street level activation, and potentially uses. So that's going to be something we'll talk about. That's could be optional. And then further, your zoning standards are your supplemental design standards, including your facade, your building standards, your parking screening. Then we'll have some alternatives to the building massing. So that allows for some variety in development. Then we'll have some building height incentives that we'll get into. And lastly, is your definitions and rules of measurements. So again, to reiterate our district boundaries, there's actually some options. We kind of went back and forth about what are we looking at? Is it just the CBD? Is it this whole, the TOD overlay district? Do we have to split up the districts? And going through and looking at the different standards, we kind of saw that there's just a lot in common within all of these. We really want a lot of, the 0 foot setback, just in terms of, vehicular access and whatnot. A lot of the standards are going to be the same. So we kind of decided that we could go with the one district, and then we ended up creating different building forms and different frontages. So this is something that can be changed. We can do the 2 different districts. It will become probably clear to you how that would be best done as we go forward. So just something to keep in mind. How is it best to kind of divvy this up?
Is that the cemetery?
I'm sorry? Yes, the big one.
Yep.
So as I said, we can create one district. We can create one district with multiple frontages, which is the route that we took, or multiple districts. And then additionally, we have the option of doing this as an overlay, as if the TOD is now. Some of the benefits of that is that you just maintain the underlying uses. You keep your, parking standards, your use standards with the underlying zoning district. Or what we could do is include the parking uses into each of the building forms in this district and remove all the underlying zoning. So that's something I'm going to ask of you to give some direction on tonight. So I just want to take a little closer look of how this fairly large district is a bit different. So on the north end, we have these smaller lots and not much parking. Those orange little blobs are the parking that is kind of off-site in those P1 areas. So what happens with the lack of public parking or the lack of centralized parking is what you get to the right. You have a lot of your building mass kind of shrinks, having to provide parking on site. That's just the market that we live in today. You can't get a business use without having approximate parking. In the downtown area is obviously a different story. We know that there are the smaller lots on the west side, a little bit larger lots on the east side, but with that proximity of public parking, you get more building mass and build out on lots. On the south end, there's actually been a lot more build out of parking, taking over those parking areas, and you can kind of see that's changed and affected the building or the lot sizes. You have bigger build outs. But traditionally, you can see, especially on the northeast side of this section, that they started off as smaller lots and eventually kind of grown together and taken over adjacent lots as they grew. But again, there's limited public parking on this side. So parking is obviously a big part and component of development standards and how everything's going to get built out. So it's just something to always keep in mind. Your building massing is going to depend on, obviously, your zoning standards. What can they build to? In terms of, Ferndale House, they said they changed their building massing by just extending their setbacks 10 feet on either side and get a much different output than what they had with the larger setbacks. Your massing is going to depend on your parking. Like I said, you can't put in an office if you don't have any parking. If you need to put in parking, you're going to end up with a smaller building on a lot. And obviously your project feasibility, your land costs, your rental rates, and then your infrastructure. Infrastructure is not that big of a component in Ferndale. It's pretty steady, but obviously something to keep in mind, especially when we were talking about putting in bigger buildings. So, excuse me. There's multiple different height standards in the form-based code as we have laid it out for you. It's not just a maximum height anymore. We do have a minimum building height, maximum height, and then you'll see that there's also height incentives to get more height, and then step backs to kind of reduce some of the building massing and height so you can create for light and air, have step backs from residential, etc. So this is the current conditions and heights. This is 9 Mile and Woodward, looking west, I believe. So tall building in the back is that residential building we were just talking about next to Ferndale House. I'm sure you all can orient fairly easily to that. This is allowable building heights as they exist today within the zoning ordinance. So if this was everything built out maxed, this is what it would look like. Because it's kind of just big and boxy, this is one of the reasons why we're proposing step backs, is so you can get something that looks more like this. I'm forgetting for a second why I have the picture of Pearl Vision, but I'm pretty sure. So just want to kind of talk about, so with that, that street level setback, which would be, as it's written in the building configuration of the different building types, it's at 27 feet. And I think that's why I included the Pearl Vision, because that's about 27 feet. So just to give you an idea, what that would look like is at that height, then you have a step back, and it kind of gives you a sense of more human scale character. So if we are talking about, building up 70 feet or whatnot, then having that step back at the street level gives it a little bit more human scale. So just to give you an idea of what that is for, there's an example in Royal Oak at the noodle place. I thought I had a picture of it. Do you know what, where the Burgers is? There's a parking structure, but there's liner buildings on Main Street. It's at like 5th, maybe. Anyways, I guess it's not a good example if no one knows that. I think I have a picture of it later here. So, this is some of the images that we showed in June, just kind of giving everyone an idea of what the building massing looks like and what it could look like. I'm just kind of reiterating it for those that weren't there. This is a street view on 9 Mile looking west. This is allowable building heights, and then again, this is with that step back. And that's a fancy gentleman.
That's today. That's today.
The one before is today. That one.
So this is today. So if you look at, this is Rust Belt to the right.
Sure. No, I get that. The next one, though.
And then this is what's existing. So that's 70 foot.
That's allowed today. Yeah, that's my question. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then that is actually showing at 30-foot height, a 20-foot setback. And again, so these are from June. We haven't updated them. This is not actually what was proposed. So I'll show you a little bit more specific later. But we said at 27 foot and only a 10-foot setback. So it's a similar concept. The numbers can obviously be changed. So, well, here we go. So there's a minimum building height proposed of 2 stories, 26 feet, and a maximum of 5 stories and 55 feet. And I guess I should kind of back up and say that there's 4 different building types. Basically, when I was going back and forth between having different districts, there wasn't really enough difference, but there is some sort of difference. So we really want to focus on storefront types in like a 9 Mile with more like transparency potentially, and there's just very minor differences such as that, and you'll kind of see as we go through. So instead of doing different districts, we decided to do different building types. So there's the storefront, a general, a townhouse, and a drive-through. I apologize, I didn't put a slide in here going through the differences on those, but it is in the draft. So the storefront would be required, or could be required on the Main Street frontage. We propose a Main Street frontage from Livernois to Paxton, fronting 9 Mile. I believe that's it. Yes. So storefront would be required just in those areas, and it would be allowed in other areas. Like a drive-through building type, a townhouse building type would not be permitted on that 9 Mile frontage. Is everyone okay with the different building forms for now? Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so then so you have your min-max of 2 and 5 stories, and then there's a feet width incentive. We have it at 100 foot now. One of the reasons for that is because of when we met with a group of architects, they kind of told us that there's really the difference between, and I'm sure Commissioner Cassio could probably speak better to this as an architect, but the difference between like stick and steel built, you go from 5 foot, and then if you're building steel, it doesn't really make dollars a cents unless you go up to like 100 foot. It also doesn't necessarily mean that it makes sense to go to 100 feet in Ferndale based on the character. So it's definitely a conversation that we need to have, and I'll be.
Can you define more about that width?
Yep.
What does the width incentive part mean there?
I'm sorry?
What does the width incentive part mean there?
Yes. Okay. So the building height incentives would mean that you would have to meet certain criteria to get to your extra stories. So it's probably a little bit difficult to read up on the screen. It is within your draft
Yeah, no, this makes sense. I remember seeing this.
on page 13.
Okay, as I say, it's page 13.
So let's kind of walk through this a little bit. So 1 story kind of equates to a half story, and 1 point, and 2 points would be a full story. So if you have a prime location, which would be a lot located in whole or part within 100 feet of the center point of the intersection of Woodward and 9 Mile. Basically, if you're at the 9 Mile and Woodward intersection,
Say 100 feet doesn't go very far from the center.
oh, it hits a couple buildings at least. You know, it's not just the 4 corner buildings. Then you could automatically go up another story because you kind of want your tallest stories at that main intersection. And then, for instance, if you have like transit and pedestrian amenities, they would have to be, you know, somewhat substantial. It's not like you're just putting a bench out in front of your building, obviously. But you could get points for that. You could get points for outdoor public art, rehabilitation of a historic structure, affordable housing, providing public parking on-site, and sustainable design.
Only because it's here and we'll get asked. Give me an example of a historic structure that you envision would qualify for this in Ferndale. I mean, we don't have
The
many
church that
lots.
was just taken down?
Well, it exists, yeah.
Or
And how,
I'm not great with the building names, but the one at the southwest corner of, 9 and Woodward,
Ferndale Center.
Ferndale Center,
And how
or something like that.
is that a relatively arbitrary determination? I mean, how is that determined in other communities? We don't have historic districts.
We don't have any
designations.
historic designations, so it is. We haven't exactly figured that out, to be honest.
I mean, is it Como's?
Well,
I mean, yeah, we would have to talk about.
I mean, from an age perspective, I mean,
That's probably the toughest part of this chart. I would say right here.
we're just playing devil's advocate.
Oh, no, yeah.
No, I'd rather beat it apart now than.
Agreed. And if you have any help in the matter. So part of it can be a bit nebulous, and I would say one reason why that's not terrible in Ferndale is that oftentimes you hear, in terms of the facades, there's obviously some bad old facades, but then some good ones, and they're not always, a traditional historic characteristic, but having some of the, like a 60s mod or some varying types is something that the people of Ferndale, I think, really value. And so it might be hard to define, but I'm not sure it's maybe a terrible thing. If you keep some of the historic facades in turn for, then going up a few stories, I think the residents would be happy with that, personally.
It leads into an active argument or discussion that we've had recently over the last 3 years, about what is a historic building in Ferndale, since we don't have the districts and the. So it'll lead back into that discussion, I think.
I agree. Well,
And I just found that.
I was hoping that
I just found
Chair
the article I
Baker
was
would be
supposed to-
really helpful in this conversation.
I was actually just looking up something that I was supposed to send Justin the other night, and it addresses your question, Dan. Are we talking about buildings? Are we talking about businesses? And I think history and heritage touch architecture as well as business traditions. And San Francisco has a heritage and landmark fund to preserve in a city that's really rapidly gentrifying what they call their heritage businesses or their landmark businesses. So
we have an example in front of us, or we had as a discussion item not that long ago, the original oldest farmhouse that sits on the ridge, or right next to the ridge. Is that historic? It's functionally obsolete. the developer wants to knock it down and put up rentals, how does that?
Under this ordinance, I believe it's outside
It's
of the
outside,
district,
but it's
yeah.
the situational example. What if it were,
Right.
100 yards to the east?
Haven't got to cut that far.
Okay. Just something to think about.
So I would say that if somebody, I mean, in terms of, I don't know the specific example that you're talking about, so that's a difficult one for me to work
It's
off
just,
of.
yeah, just the planning commission saw it.
Yeah. But I would say if anyone's taking the extra step to maintain a historic structure or business, that's a great idea. Kind of no matter what it is. Gosh, I guess it's kind of difficult. But that is, I mean, they're only going to do if it makes sense, I guess.
Sure.
They're not going to maintain an old historic structure that isn't valuable, I guess.
In going back to a conversation we had last night about who determines, I guess, what public art is or what art is in the community, because you can obviously get incentive points for that as well. Is it possible, or is there a commission, a historic commission in Ferndale who could kind of make that assessment?
We have an arts commission.
We do have an arts commission, yeah. So that's who we're saying could perhaps define what qualifies as art for these purposes. But
We have a historic district commission. Normally, we don't know. There's a small nonprofit that does community history, but
so I guess
not a city body.
okay.
Yeah.
So could that possibly become a commission within the city that makes that determination? I guess could that be a part of this?
We've had an
form-based
ongoing
code?
discussion about that, and there's mixed feelings back and forth about that because there are strings that come with a historic district. Not everyone's completely comfortable with. It's not just a designation. There's also rules, regulations around it from the state perspective. And we've tasked that nonprofit historical group, who's brought this up a number of times, to come back with a proposal of where it does work and it is non-intrusive. And we've been waiting almost 2 years for that. So.
Okay, but as opposed to maybe a historic district, could it be more of a case-by-case basis as somebody comes forward with a property that they believe to be a historic property, and this commission makes a judgment call on if that qualifies or not?
Sort of similar to the DDA's design committee.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yep. Correct.
I mean, I would argue, I think that idea has a lot of merit. On the other side of keeping things smaller, I would argue that it in lack of any other commission or committee, it's the planning commission's role to do that.
I could see the planning commission doing that as well.
My feedback to both those points would be that I believe Birmingham has a commission that they use for these instances. But then again, it adds to the process and the timeline of a project approval, so it can be, there's benefit and.
Are there perhaps, is there perhaps some type of burden of proof that's not too onerous that we could put on the applicant? There's been, both by the Historical Society and the DDA, documentation and studies done. These mostly relate to architecture, not to business types or businesses themselves, whereby you need to come, and if you're claiming this or applying for this incentive, you as the applicant need to come to the Planning Commission with some level of proof of the style of your building, the year that it was built, its historic uses. I mean, that is relatively well documented between the city, the Historical Society, and the DDA. I mean, is that a reasonable burden to put on a developer if we're going to give them incentive points for historic preservation?
I definitely think there should be some clarity, whether it's a list of something you have to check off, whatever, some sort of clarity besides just an arbitrary decision making. There should be some criteria.
I mean, my house was built in 1919, but I don't think it's historic. It's just old.
Now, if you found Hoffa in it, it would be historic.
Sorry, Commissioner Cassio, the Commissioner Woodson.
I was just going to say, can there just be a body that maybe does the legwork up front and takes a snapshot in time right now and determines what properties in the city are historic today, and then that moving forward would be properties that would be considered historic?
That'd be a request to the council, maybe to put something together and allocate some funds.
To your point, though, Chair Baker, it's considering the context in which we're having the discussion, that this would be something that would be brought to the city by a developer that wants to go up substantially higher in height than what we have anywhere in the city. I don't think it's an unreasonable burden to require the developer to do some research and come forward with a proposal that explains exactly what the historic significance is of what they're looking to preserve. I don't see that as being a substantial burden when you want to possibly go up to 8 stories.
And it'd be fascinating to see a proposal that shows, because we don't have any buildings that high today, that by saving a historical building, you can add 2 more floors to it. I don't know what that even looks like.
Well, would it be that specific building that they were going to add floors to, or would it be they're going to preserve a historical building, and in exchange for that, they want to add additional
in
floors
another location?
Somewhere else.
to their development? That's the way I'm looking at it.
Okay.
And it is, just for clarification, the number system, you have to get 2 points for 1 floor.
Yeah.
Oh, 1 story.
And you could only get 1 floor for historic preservation.
Right. Yeah.
There's a maximum. I mean, that could change, but that's how it was written, that you could only get, so technically, if you're only doing historic rehabilitation, then you could only go 6 stories maximum. Of course, you can combine points, and as I said, you could change it because I actually didn't think of it that way, that you could preserve a historic site and then,
Yeah, I didn't either. It's a great point.
do an adjacent site.
Oh, right.
So in that case, maybe we do, if it's a really significant historic rehabilitation, then potentially we think it would be worth more than 2 points. I want to back up maybe just a little bit to say that the 5-story max is less than what's currently allowed.
Right.
Part of the reason we did that was because it's just a max for the entire large district. And then also we thought that currently buildings, so every building that you've seen approved in the past 2 years hasn't maxed 5 stories, and it's mostly because they've all been stick built. So there's kind of the cap for that. So we're saying that for people to get that more development potential, that they have to work for it. They have to prove to the city that they're giving back for us to give them that development potential.
Did you have another question or comment, Michael?
Just about having the developer do the legwork for a historic property, that still puts the onus on the planning commission to make that judgment call. So then there still is a body that is making a decision on what is historic and what's not.
Right. I just think some sort of guidelines or criteria just to have some consistency and clarity, both for any developer as well as changing over for a commission. I think it would be a very solid step to take for consistency's sake.
That said, I don't want us to have to be the body that goes out and does the research. If someone comes in and says, hey, this structure is historic, I'm going to preserve it.
Right.
They should do the research, bring it to the commission, and if the commission then has some guidelines to say, well, does this fit or does it not, then
Can I-
that's the best case.
Can I play a bit of devil's advocate here? Excuse me. I would say there's probably properties that I can think of, definitely can think of, that I wouldn't want to be preserved to meet this criteria. But again, I would say that so I'm kind of struggling with, on the moment, thinking of if you could preserve one historic structure and then build on another lot, because what if someone just says, oh, well, hey, I own these 2 buildings and I'm just going to leave this one be and I'm preserving a historic structure, so give me more buildable height on this side lot. So in the moment, I can't necessarily, I'm not seeing how that works. I'm not saying it couldn't. But then, so how I've always thought about it is mostly it would be like maintaining a facade is what I mostly think of with, preserving a historic structure. Mostly because I've heard that a lot of the structures in the downtown aren't necessarily buildable on top because of how they've been built. I could be wrong about that, but please correct me if I'm wrong, to those of you that know. So if I'm thinking that I and again, I'm not a developer, but I'm pretty sure that it's cheaper to tear down an entire building and put one up rather than preserve a facade and build behind it. Not always the case? Anyone? No? I've heard this.
I mean,
it might depend on the site, I suppose.
it's certainly a touchy subject about what the value is that you're preserving, right? So is it?
I guess what I'm saying is nobody's going to do that unless there's
that, but
because it's not cost efficient. I think for the developer to do that, so they're only going to do it if there's a reason, somebody thinks it's valuable enough that they're going to put the cost into preserving that.
well, and that you think either your street frontage or something else is valuable, right? So if it's a 1 or 2 story existing facade, what is it that we're preserving? So are we just preserving the pedestrian scale of that street frontage? And if so, the historicness, even if it's not quote unquote historic, it's part of the character and the existing nature of. So I guess what I'm saying is, if somebody thinks it's kind of like the same argument for public art. What is art? Art is going to be different to everyone. If someone, obviously we have to have a threshold that's going to make it significant enough that we're, giving back. But yeah, I mean, I think the Planning Commission and the council, at least informally, have both expressed interests in something that incents historic preservation. So, I mean, I'm at work for the Detroit Historical Society, but I run the finance department. So the ability of us to put that together as a planning commission is probably pretty limited. So we would be looking to staff and to our consultants to help us maybe look at some best practices from other cities. I mean, if there's something that you want us to read through from Birmingham or
Birmingham's difficult because they do. I mean, I did look to theirs. So they do have the commission. They do have also designations. So we can put together something a little bit better. I guess what I'm trying to get at is maybe my threshold would be a bit lower than some others. And in terms of the historic character, because when we're talking about the historic nature, there's not, it's not, we don't have the main branch of the Detroit Library or something like that. There's not that sense, and I think the residents of Ferndale sometimes value some of the, I guess lower value historic facades. I don't have a better way to put it, but I don't know if you am getting what I mean. But
I mean, I would look at our post office as an example.
Yeah.
A building that has, it's a typical small town downtown.
Magic Bag.
Gotcha.
Well, because it has a giant buildable lot next door was what my comment was going to be. So if, for example, you preserve whether it's just the facade or the front building of the post office, are we now allowing you to build something larger, through this transferable sort of air rate sort of thing, behind it, and does that fulfill our intent of historic preservation? Part of my intent would be for that space to be used, not just frozen in time or mothballed so that my streetscape looks the same, but that it's still active and it's part of the development. In that case, I don't think preserving a facade benefits us one way or another because it is a relatively typical sort of looking structure, but it's an important space in the neighborhood. I don't know.
The example is helpful. I mean,
the post office is the one that comes to mind because it's a relatively big parcel that we maybe have a conversation about sooner than we think, right? Who knows what's going to happen there? Mm-hmm. They've been talking about it for years.
That's helpful. Okay, we can come back with better recommendations.
Okay.
I would say, just in terms of some of these others, the affordable housing will mimic the affordable housing policy. I put in these examples of the 20-40% units just as kind of placeholders, so don't really put too much onto that. Same with sustainable design. Those are going to be constructed by the new sustainability planner once she kind of gets her feet wet. So Other than that, any other comments in terms of anything you think is missing or something you don't think should be has enough merit for allowing more height?
Just not on the incentives, but I think you will have an interesting and electric discussion around that 8-story max with incentive. Because I know there's mixed views on that.
Yeah, so let's actually maybe talk a little bit more about that. I would say that I personally kind of like the max at 5 with the incentives, especially with the prime location. That kind of gives you an automatic at the prime locations. But in terms of maybe locations within the district, so for that storefront building type, I identified the Main Street frontage. I think that's pretty basic, and but in terms of the height, should we kind of maybe more mimic what's existing? Are there, I guess, what are you thinking in terms of?
My feedback would be, and I'm interested what everybody else says, is, and the mayor will probably disagree with me, but this is a discussion document. If you want to put in 8 now for discussion, as long as we're clear, that's the point of it, and get the temperature of this body and council and the other folks that'll look at it. I don't see any harm in keeping it in right now. My thought is eventually we would reduce it, but this is kind of an early phase, and you can let the discussion happen and see where we land, and I think that will be less than 8. But as far as changing it today, I don't know that you have to today. But be really clear that it's for discussion. I'd put it right on the front page.
Agreed.
Like confidential discussion. Crystal, it's for discussion. No.
Looking at I think we could gut test this as well, pretty quickly, and if we find out that there's a strong feeling that there are very few spaces that would be appropriate for something that high, I think we limit the options, so to do a provision of significant improvements to public infrastructure and facilities to get you 4 stories. I mean,
4 points, 2 stories.
4 points.
Significant.
Yeah.
4 points.
2 stories.
Sorry, to get you 4 points. I mean, that would be significant. So I just don't see a lot of opportunities for the conversation to even come up, and I wonder if the planning commission, based on prior conversations about height and Woodward width and massing and transit and all of these things, if we think that many stories is appropriate for only certain spaces in the district, I guess my recommendation would be to restrict it and just not have the conversation in the rest of the neighborhood, because this is a huge neighborhood that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So if you just did one giant overlay, and everybody could potentially figure out a way to do these, these points, but if the commission says, what, I like that radius from the center of 9 and Woodward, and those buildings seem appropriate for this type of conversation, but the rest I'm not.
Yeah, maybe define a smaller district that might be, for conversation. I think that's a fine idea.
It could be an option, unless we then say, or we could say no. I think
And again, as it's for discussion, why not bring me 2 or 3 proposals? Bring me one that says it is. Bring me one that's got a radius out of 9 and Woodward that say that may be appropriate, and bring me one that caps it at 6.
So what's the feeling of the commission in terms of, we've talked a lot in the past about the giant width that is Woodward Avenue, and in general architecture form, what you could or could not put there in terms of scale. And then I think in general we've actually notched down a little bit. So you look at what the textbook would tell you could do in relation to that width, and then at least if I remember correctly, we've notched it down a little bit.
I agree with the width of it, but Woodward could stand taller, but then we have such narrow properties on Woodward, so you can't just look at it on one side and not look at it on the other. So there's not a lot of transition from Woodward to what's behind it. It's very narrow corridors, so.
That's a great point in terms of how it impacts the side streets.
Well, I wonder if that could be resolved by the different frontage types that are written into this this draft, or perhaps the different districts. As I flip through this, I think we have main streets, which are 9 and Woodward, correct? But perhaps the street behind that might be the next general or some other frontage type, which would basically have a step down in its height restriction or setbacks or something of that nature.
I was also thinking frontages until this conversation, which I just think I had maybe a better idea that would be less confusing in implementation. Because if you implement too many frontage types, it just gets confusing. You know, if this frontage type and it'd be this height. And what we could do is just do, like, as we said, within 100 feet of 9 and Woodward, you have so many points. We can just we can limit the number of stories you get through the height incentives table. So basically, you can just say, well, you know, if you're on Woodward, you can have a max of so many points, or if, and you know, elsewhere you have a different maximum or something like that. I think it would be a little bit easier to implement than the frontage types, but it's essentially doing the same thing.
I think the challenge, sorry, I don't know if I cut in line or not, but I think the challenge still remains where Woodward in its width and its frontage is one thing, but these streets don't have a secondary street behind them. You're just going straight into other parcels, in a lot of cases. You do have some area close to 9 Mile and Woodward where you do have a secondary street where you do have a little bit of a buffer, but in many cases it's going straight back to some of the residential properties. There's, you're no longer on these two major corridors. We don't really have, a core downtown, with a grid system. It's two corridors that hit each other. So that is a pretty unique challenge as far as talking about these heights. So I don't know. I think, with the exception of that corner at 9 Mile and Woodward, it gets very challenging when you're talking some of these big increases of the heights for maximum. For me, I know it's 30 feet over the current highest level, is my understanding. When you're talking 100 foot with incentive, but that's at the highest level of the highest section of all these districts. It's more than double some other ones. So that's very extreme to me.
Yeah, I share the concern. I mean, you go 5 blocks north of Woodward and 9, or 5 blocks south of Woodward and 9, and you've got properties here that are fronting on Woodward, but these are relatively shallow properties that literally have, within 60, 70 feet, you've got residential properties right off of Woodward. Putting even a 6-story building on some of those parcels, I think, I don't know. When I think about the possibility of going up to 8 stories in some of those parcels that are getting that far away from the actual 9 and Woodward corner, it gives me a lot of pause.
That height at 9 and Woodward gives me pause.
I know.
Honestly,
I know.
It feels like it would be a really detached. It would be detached from everything else.
And the actual parcels then on those 4 corners are far apart from one another.
Right.
You actually still have a big gap, so it would feel somewhat isolated.
Yeah.
So as a suggestion, why don't we keep the radius from 9 and Woodward idea, that still resonates with me, and use that as a 6-story top out?
Because I think we heard that no one builds 6 stories.
Right.
It's not.
You're essentially just limiting yourself to 5.
viable.
Yeah, either
Yeah.
way.
I'm okay with that.
That this typical 4 to 5 space that we're seeing is
Yeah.
is what you see unless you've got a tall steel structure.
Yeah,
So.
okay. I mean, I'm good with 5.
Unless you.
So this is very different than what we've talked about in the past. I think if our former chair were here, just trying to channel Sarah, we might be having a different conversation about more density as it relates to height. And we did talk. The building that didn't get built near Affirmations, there was a conversation about are you looking for height or are you looking for density? And at least in my case, I was looking for density. I wasn't looking for a false facade. I wasn't looking for, sort of something to help me enclose the streetscape. I was looking for density. This was a couple of years ago, this conversation where they were like, well, we could put a deck here and building back here. And it's like, if we know we're already ahead of the region on transit-oriented planning, do we want to put ourselves further ahead? We wanted to be ahead of the curve. Now, for political reasons, we're really ahead of the curve. Do we want to stay ahead of the curve? Is it in our best interest as a city?
Can I make a few comments before we move? I want to continue this discussion. Just a little bit of feedback. I guess what I'd go back. So currently, the development costs don't make sense for like a 6 or 7.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that won't change. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we have to make zoning decisions based on the developer's side of things. We want to keep it in mind. So I just go back to kind of the 3 prongs. We have the community side, I already forgot what they were, but whatever. You know what I'm talking about? So we can keep in mind the developer side and say that, if we do only do 6 or 7, we might just be limiting ourselves to 5. However, that can always change. So just keep that in mind. And then I would also say, I know it. The yellow circle then would include the different capacity of the sites. But I'm not going to the right slide, but you are going to be very limited on most of those sites to build higher than. It's actually very challenging to right now build 2 stores, just because of parking. So a lot of these, especially on the north end, a lot of these sites will have a hard time just being redeveloped as it stands, having a 2-story minimum because of parking. I think that's a bigger conversation about how we can plan for parking in the future to allow for some redevelopment and to allow for some density, especially thinking of Woodward as a major transit corridor. But that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing here. Just something obviously to keep in mind. So, and then I guess another comment. So yes, those sites are narrow. That will limit the development potential, and it does keep them close to the residential. But then the next part of this height discussion is stepbacks and setbacks from residential. So I don't want to necessarily push this away because I think this is a great conversation, but maybe we can move forward and then we can always come back because we'll talk about context, sensitivity, and how we can reduce massing to make it feel a little bit less kind of ominous or like.
Yeah, I just want to add one other thought based on the last time we did our zoning ordinance update in going to 70 feet at some of these key intersections and key areas in the downtown was a deliberate transit-oriented strategy, right? We wanted to be ready when the transit came and the market was right and people saw an opportunity to build. So we're seeing some of that, maybe lower than would be allowable because the transit isn't here yet, and you still have to figure out parking, and you have to figure out these other things that eat into your bottom line. But if I guess some guidance from the commission or otherwise on whether we think we're still at the right height to be ready to capture those transit opportunities and not let them pass us by in terms of development when it comes. Do we think that 70 is the right thing or that it needs to be higher? We haven't topped out at it yet, but we haven't got transit yet. So we went higher to capture a market that didn't quite exist that we saw coming, and it's still kind of coming. It doesn't quite exist. Does it need to be higher, or have we already aligned ourselves with the market that's now 10 years behind where we thought it might be?
One thing we could do, if you don't mind, so when we talk about transit and pedestrian amenities in the height incentives, we could include a radius to a transit station as one of the, so that we're planning for the future. So I would say, thinking of all the development along Woodward with the rail line, one, it's a very intricate kind of dance that they're doing is the development and when the transit came in. I mean, for years it was, it's coming, but when is it actually coming and when is it coming? And you see that now that it's actually getting built, the development potential is majorly increasing. And so I would say that Ferndale's very progressive and wants to be ready for something like that. So yes, maybe just keep that in mind, and maybe we can build this incentive chart. We can make it maybe more, kind of stringent. We think that never, we don't ever want to go to 8 stories because that's just not who we are, or at least not now. But maybe we can go a little bit higher, and it's only for these specific things. So we can say, public art's really awesome, but that doesn't mean that you can build a 7-story building.
I think
Obviously, that's kind of already built in, but you know what I mean? We can make it a little bit more strict if we need to.
To Chair Baker's point, though, at what point are we being hopelessly progressive? I'll use that term. In that, yes, we're ready for transit. We got it. We embraced it. We're ahead of everybody else. But the back end of that boat sunk, and we'll still say it's coming, but there's no light that's the train at the end of the tunnel right now. It's kind of dead, to a degree from as far as reaching us. So how much is just being, again, hopelessly progressive versus practical? Is that kind of where you're going?
Sort of was it, when it gets here to 70 feet suddenly make more financial sense for them, and
Right.
do I need to adjust to 100 if that's what makes financial sense for them now? If it isn't, if it creates great discomfort in our community.
I think one element, I think the one that sticks out to me of all of these items is the inclusive housing portion, and just conversations of just people interested in developing in Ferndale, and many of them have came and went, and some of them have done projects since they've been here. But I think getting that extra height is really what will make that inclusive housing policy come to life. I mean, the policy for us can only affect city-owned property or property that gets incentives, but this would, I think, allow for that opening to do that. I don't know if public art should really be on the list. To get to 70, but
again, I know I'm playing devil's advocate here, and I don't even believe everything I'm saying, but I brought this point up before too. We're way ahead of our master plan on housing right now, right? So how much farther ahead of our own plan do we want to get at the risk of holding the bag? In 3 years when the market drops out or whenever. There's a reason we had those estimates in the master plan. We're so far ahead of it already today. How much more far ahead of it do we want to encourage? I think that's a discussion we haven't had yet.
I think it is an important discussion, one that I would agree with. But there's also almost, they're estimates for a reason, so you can't really, it's not a true number. We don't really know what's going to happen in the future, so we do want to make sure that we're preventing what we don't want for sure, but then also allowing and encouraging what potentially can happen.
I agree. Let me just say that. But what I know on my list of what I don't want for sure is a real estate glut with a lot of vacancy, and that's the discussion I want to have because you raise very valid points.
Yep. I wanted to bring up one other point. So before we had the joint meeting in June, we had a meeting with architects and developers, and they said that right now Ferndale is so hot that the developers are willing to take a much reduced rate in return just to build and have Ferndale as part of their portfolio. So that is definitely a reality that we're existing in right now. Of course, markets can always change. So I just want to point that out since I thought it was a pretty interesting point that they made.
I guess just one more thing is that in reducing our max height without incentives, I think we are that sets us up to at least get some benefits as a city when developers do come in and want to build something that is now 70 feet. So let's say a 5-story building. Now, not only do we get that 5-story building, but we also get some amenities such as a LEED building or a green building or something, or public art, or something else that will really benefit the city and help us. So,
Agreed.
so I like the fact that we've reduced the height in order to get something back. And maybe part of those incentives are also, creating another use, like creating commercial space, as opposed to just creating a glut of housing. Maybe office space would be an incentive of a point or something as well.
That's an interesting point that I'm surprised that's not already in here, because somebody brought it up at the June meeting that we should incentivize different uses. So thank you for bringing that up.
That's a great point.
Yeah, it may also help.
And I know it's work for future discussions, but having those graphics where you show either current height, existing approved height, or within our ordinance now, and then what the future heights are, having those and then having them actually match what the discussions will be in the future is going to be very helpful. Some of these discussions that we're having is obviously, you can't put a 100-foot tall building on Woodward with a house right behind it, but having that more accurately represented with some of those graphics would be helpful for discussion, so people are all on the same page when you're looking at a picture. Versus, some of the confusions on the tables, and then when there's actually different setbacks.
Definitely.
Yeah, if we're such a hot market, and we are already seeing losses that we're uncomfortable with. I'm thinking back to our historic structures now, the convent, the church across the street, the conversation on Pinecrest, as Commissioner Casio was talking about, the not an overall maximum change, but a reduction with then some additional points. We're no longer just giving sort of the green light to all development. We're saying that, Fernhill is a really great place, and if you want to be here, this is the character you're helping us build and preserve. So,
and I think this document gives us some power that we don't have right now to create a community that we all want to see that's not currently represented in our ordinance. So whether or not this maximum height is the right number, I think this is the right direction for the city. So maybe that's one line item that needs to be addressed. And again, I think that actually can be resolved in a lot of ways in the setbacks that we're about to discuss. But I think we shouldn't, throw the baby out with the bathwater here. So I hope that's not where this conversation is going.
Not at all. Not from my perspective.
You guys just reminded me of a quote from a chair from another planning commission that I heard. It was part of the discussion. It was something like, yes, we want to be business friendly, but we also want our businesses to be community friendly. So I agree that this is a nice give and take. Okay, so the first step back that I wanted to discuss was this kind of street level one. This is the example I was talking about in Royal Oak. This is the jewelers on the corner there, and they're like Burgers is right there. Burgers might even be gone by now, but so if you can recall this block, it's difficult to tell by this picture, but the new development matches the height of the jeweler building on the corner, though it goes 4 or 5 stories higher. But it's from the street level. It kind of gives this more like pedestrian skilled height character. We had a lot of discussion. I'm sure Commissioner Ocasio will bring up the discussion that we had at the design committee last night. This is something that is proposed currently in both the storefront and the general building types. And so that would be something that would be required all over. I think after the discussion yesterday, it's, and depending on what we have tonight, it definitely is something that might be better, that would be more like variable or not required everywhere, or potentially not even required. but anyways, just to give you an idea of what it is, basically it's saying at 27 feet on your front lot line, you have then a step back of 10 feet. So if you kind of look at this sketch, on the left there, it would be your front lot line, and then that would be a 27-foot height and your 10-foot step back. So again, that's allowing for that kind of the character on the street level to be more human or pedestrian scaled, and then the 10-foot width is a width that would allow for a functional balcony. So those are kind of the reasonings behind it. Move forward, discussion. Do you want to talk about your concern?
I guess I would want to gauge the commission's reaction to 27 feet as a height restriction for that step back. Personally, I would think that number should be closer to the right-of-way, but I know that that is significantly more. On 9 Mile, that's probably closer to 60 feet. So
Actually 70.
So, for what it's worth, for everyone's knowledge, the rule of thumb is for, I guess, pedestrian comfort. It's really a 1-to-1 ratio. So, on 9 Mile, that would be, you know, a 60-foot high building before you had to step back a certain amount, which might be 10 feet or might be more.
And then for additional conversation, in this picture, I don't know the exact height, but it looks like it's probably more like 35. It's a 3-story, it looks like. So there's that.
Does that rule of thumb take into account site furnishings and things that are happening in front of the property line? Like planters and benches and trees?
I believe that's from site property line to property line across the street.
But you can get away with, just from those kind of discussions, you can get away with shorter heights with trees, other things that kind of have a lower, it makes it feel smaller than it actually is, the distance and the spacing as well. But it's kind of hard to get those urban trees to grow.
Yeah.
So that's another discussion with the city, I guess.
To answer Commissioner Azar's question, that does not. That's at a 0-foot setback. So the step back would be at the 0 foot.
Right.
And yeah. So if you can, I'll kind of jump ahead actually. So this would be the siting requirements for the 4 different building forms. So you have your so we have a build to and a setback. So what we're used to and what's in the existing ordinance is a setback, and we have a 0-foot setback. With the TOD, it's a maximum, I believe. With the build to, it's a requirement that you build to that 0-foot lot line for, in the storefront building form, it would be 80% of the lot width. So that could account, you know, if somebody, so the market's going to dictate that probably everyone's going to build as much as possible. So they're going to do 100% lot line to lot line, 100% to the 0 foot. But what the 80% does is allow for variation, and so maybe somebody really wants a nice outdoor patio or something, and so they could take that 20% of their lot width and put it and not build to the 0 foot. Or it just allows for public amenities. It wouldn't allow for parking or anything like that, auto-oriented.
Does it actually encourage it? Does it actually encourage it? I mean, if we want variation in articulation, this is...
It allows for it.
Probably more specific ways to require it, though.
Yeah, it doesn't require it, it allows for it. So you have your build to, and so take a little step back, and more generally, I'll kind of align you to the lot. So right now we have a front lot line, side lot lines, and a rear lot line. On corner lots, we don't actually have a requirement that those 2 street frontages are treated as frontages. There's a front and a side currently. So with this, I would change that you actually do have 2 street frontages. But we talk about it as the primary street frontage and the side street frontage. So you have your primary street. So if you think of Rosie's would actually have 3 frontages. They would have their primary street, which would be 9 Mile, and then 2 side street frontages. It makes it a little bit tricky on Troy because you have their through lots. So you have your 9th Street frontage and a side street on the Troy. So on your side street, you have a build to requirement as well. It's a little bit less. It's a 60% build to requirement. So thinking of Rosie's, you build to the line, which it is not, right? But then you could allow for a patio with a 60%, 40% of your lot width could be pushed back to allow for some public area or private. Does everyone get the build to concept? Okay. So you can kind of see how there's differences in the different building forms. All of them are the same in terms of setbacks, and those are the existing setbacks. So you have your 0-foot side and front setbacks. If you're adjacent to a residential district, you have a 10-foot setback. And then if you have an alley, you have 0-foot, you can build all the way. Or if there's no alley, we allow for a 10-foot setback. That kind of allows for, loading, unloading, waste management, those sorts of things that would be taking place if you had alley. Not that they actually occur in the alley, but it just kind of gives a little bit of buffer. So the main differences would be your build-tos in the different building forms. I would say, since I haven't already described this, the townhouse building form is how I imagine it, or kind of wrote it to be, is more like the design for the 360 on Withington lot. So remember, it was a big building with the townhomes fronting Withington. Everyone probably was not part of that, but I guess it's not a good example if nobody was on that. But basically, it was a typical type of building.
We're getting that far, frankly.
But then there was kind of townhomes stuck to the front of it. So it's really
360 did? All right, I must be getting old. That was planned. Yeah, I think that was 360.
I don't know. Council played with that and didn't bring it here, so we don't know.
Wish we would have sent it to you.
Yeah, you should have.
Right. There's townhomes on the
Live and learn. Sorry.
Oh, I think it was a different iteration that actually maybe only staff saw. I apologize for that.
So
okay.
The conversation we had
not
earlier.
Not a good example.
The conversation we had earlier about Withington frontage. When I read the memo, and it's either a townhouse or condo or something, when my brain immediately went to a building stuck on a building.
Right.
Is that sort of what you're describing?
Sort of. It does. I mean, it could.
I was glad it wasn't.
It could actually. I've seen many examples where it works well.
Okay.
It probably depends on the developer. In this case, that would be kind of the idea. Except, I guess the difference would be is that there is. So if we go back to this kind of street level setback. It doesn't show it on here, but there would be a 40-foot step back after the 2 or 3 stories. So it's basically, it is kind of pushing it out. So if you don't like the idea of it looking different, but what that does allow for is if you have residential facing residential, it kind of meets the building height and character. So if you're thinking of...
It feels like residential.
Yeah, it feels more like residential.
And I think that's what is kind of proposed for the dot right now. And correct me if I'm wrong. There's those townhomes that would be attached to that deck facing.
I thought they had a
across town.
single entrance, though. I didn't think
We
they
do
had
a single entrance.
It's an apartment.
I thought they.
They looked like wall houses.
Yeah, it's more apartments at least at this stage.
Yeah.
You all get to help decide if that makes sense or not.
You actually get to see that one.
How are we doing on time? Are we getting through your stuff, or should we stop talking?
I don't know. It's all good discussion.
I don't know how many slides you have, which is so how are we?
We're doing pretty well,
Okay.
I think. Okay, so
I'd like to see how far we can get by 9.
okay.
Okay.
Thank you for keeping us on track.
Yep.
Kate.
Okay.
Oh, good. I need dinner.
So this is the more important, probably step back.
Break.
Do you want to take a break?
No.
No, we're good.
Is a residential setback, and so I just wanted to illustrate a couple different ways that could happen because it's just more helpful. So basically, again, I'll orient you. On the left side would be the street frontage. On the right side, where you see the 16-foot, that's an alley. This is actually the example up above where... I just realized that because
That's the
I
back
opened this in
building.
a PDF, my transition slides weren't working, but it's not important. So this is kind of mimicking the Ferndale lofts, at least in terms of the lot width. This is a typical kind of lot
if the alley
size.
were the street.
Yep. Well, if it was flipped.
Yeah.
Yes.
The alley were the street. Yeah.
So that lot, is, as seen in the picture, is a 16-foot, alley, not lot, 16-foot alley, and then the lot width would be that lot width. The different ways they can do this is have just a step back from the rear.
Didn't you know she gave up Cokes?
I didn't know she gave up.
I knew she gave up. I'm sorry. This is okay. I'm gonna try not to distract us again. I apologize.
I won't leave you hanging. Thank you.
Okay, so basically what this is showing is from the rear lot line going up, your 27 feet, which is kind of your 2 stories, and then having a 15-foot setback to make it more contextually, like in height from a residential district or a lot. And then additionally what it's showing is the front 60%, or 66% of the lot is the tall part with the front, and then the shorter side is like the rear 33. So you could split the lot into like thirds, and the rear third have a smaller building height than your front, and then you just get the boxes. Or what I think is actually written into the proposed or the draft is this idea of from the lot line, so especially in the cases where you might not have an alley or whatnot, you actually go from the lot line of the residential lot and you go up 20 feet, and then you have a 60-degree angle towards the lot. And so anything above that would be your max height. So in this view, it would be above the upper dashed line. So the dark purple would not be permitted. But you could build up to that line. You could have a combination of these, so you can go your 27 foot, have your 15 setback, and then your 60-degree angle height. Gets a little complicated in implementation.
I don't know.
Sorry?
Where did 27 come from?
It's like a 2-story with so if you have your 16-foot first floor for a retail and 11-foot second story.
15 and 12 or something. Yeah. Okay.
Not a good number?
Yeah, I got it.
Again, those numbers can change. You could do a step back just at 3 stories. What Justin and I actually implemented this on the dot and found that it would comply with, basically comply with the angled measurements. So because if you think of the dot, it does abut the residential. So if you're working, of course we didn't have exact measurements, but we kind of overlaid this concept, and that seemed to be a good rule of measurement. It was better than the step backs because it allows a little bit more flexibility.
So this is most important on the side that abuts residential, regardless of what side that is. I guess I can't think of an example where we'd have like front-facing apartments on one side and back-facing. No, it's a stupid question. Never mind.
Well, so in terms of Withington, you would have a residential lot across the right-of-way.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you just have more right-of-way width. So you could implement the same standards. Mm-hmm. There's not too many, like maybe 1 or 2 instances where you would have a side lot line in the district that would abut a residential district. So,
I just think it's interesting that we're looking at a back facade. It's a really good example.
Some of it was in response to the Wolf River 409
Yeah,
film.
exactly. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I wasn't part of that.
And we changed the site orientation because we didn't have that step back requirement.
Right.
Interesting. Okay. Do you need anything from us on this, or are we still going, or?
I guess my recommendation would be to have the initial step back and then plus the angle, just like the 15-foot. Or, you know, you could have a 20-foot setback. It could be at 27 feet. It could be at 33, 38. You know, those numbers can change. But I would suggest having both of those standards. Does anyone?
I guess the numbers aren't as important to me as the feel. So if these numbers achieve that less imposing feel, and when it comes to balconies, having a 10-foot step back so you can have a 10-foot balcony still puts your balcony in my backyard. So I don't know if you're going to have a 10-foot balcony, do you need a 20-foot step back?
So the 10 foot's from the primary street, as my understanding, or the street that it's facing,
Right.
and then the residential is from any adjacent property, like is behind it or something. So it's it's a different thing. The 20 foot with the 60-degree angle would be like for the parcel behind it,
Would be for the
as
back.
Any
opposed
abutting
to the
property.
road. So it would actually be more restrictive
For
for
the
the
backyard.
balcony, right?
Okay.
It would be much more than the 10 foot. Because there's all of them have a rear setback of 10 feet, plus you would have the from 20 feet up 60-degree angle setback. What am I going for?
So
Step
that's
back?
this line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it does mean that my balcony isn't overhanging my neighbor.
Yes.
Because I'm step back and I'm angled.
Yes. There's also, and this might be maybe too restrictive in terms of the percentage, but if you go to page 11 in the additional standards, there's rooftop and upper story decks. And that would prohibit rooftop and upper story decks in the rear 35% of the lot depth. So that would be anywhere here.
Right.
And that would be so you don't have an imposing, potentially we could either, reduce the percentage, or we can say unless, you have a solid 6-foot wall that shields you from the adjacent neighbors, something like that, which I believe is the case in the dot. I'm not entirely, I haven't seen the site plans, but I believe they do have in that rear 35, it would be considered the rear 35. They have those balconies, no? But there's a solid wall.
This one actually has it here.
Your
On page
head
11 has that as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, rooftops must provide solid walls when adjacent to residential.
Right. So that's to maintain privacy if, your adjacent residential district. And then obviously the step backs are for similar reasons, but then also for light and air.
For clarification with that mass reduction adjacent to residential, so I know it says like that 60-degree, that plane towards the center of the lot line, or the center of the lot. Is I think the way it's worded?
Mm-hmm.
Does it then end at the center of the lot, so everything can go vertical from there?
It's just,
Or does it continue all the way through those 2 points?
just towards the center of the lot, so
Okay.
there wouldn't be an end. So,
So it's
yes,
just towards-
basically. Yeah. So as
it's
you can
just 60 degrees from towards the front, not necessarily just the center. Or I guess
Well, so the
because
problem
it
is
could
you're
be
not always
from the
coming from the
side.
rear.
Yeah, so it can be from the side as
Yes.
well. Okay.
It's not likely going to happen because there's only a couple lots
Right.
that it would be adjacent to the
Okay.
side.
So that just continues through. It doesn't stop there.
Right.
Gotcha.
As you can see, I believe this is actually scaled to be a 100-foot building. So it doesn't really take off too much of the potential, except in that rear 35%, and that's mostly above like a 3-story level. If that helps you. So, you know, if this was a 70-foot building, it'd be down here. You could build most of the lot to your max height. You know, if it was 5 stories, it'd be more like down here. So, if that helps contextually. And that's why I would propose this initial step back, regardless of, you know, the degree of angle.
The 15 foot, yeah.
Just because there's less variability in that. Any other comments? Okay, so we've really talked about a lot of this. I would add, okay, I guess that's next. Oh, here, I didn't even show you this graphic, so obviously this is your kind of, this, and we'll have these for each of the building forms. We kind of wanted to wait till we had a little bit more direction to finalize these. But the next thing we're going to get to is parking, and I'll just point out that this kind of shows what I mean by parking setback. So you're going to have your building setback, and then we're going to have a parking setback of 30 feet on your Main Street frontages. So that basically means that something like Ferndale House, where they have parking on the first floor, the parking would not be permitted within the first 30-foot setback from the primary street.
I like that.
Where's that? Okay. And so surface parking between the building and the primary street or the side street is not permitted in any of the building forms. The parking setback changes between the building forms, so not the frontages, as I just misspoke. So the storefront would be 30 foot, your general would be 20 foot, your townhouse would be 20 foot, but only for 75% of the frontage.
Where did you get the 30 foot from? Is that an industry standard or?
That's what you need to have like a retail store.
Per who?
Per industry standard. So the 20 foot is kind of thinking, so the storefront, we want active street front uses. And we'll get to that we actually, on the storefront, will require an active use for the first 30 feet, only for 75% of the frontage. That way you could allow for different kind of uses for 75%. We'll get to that in a second, but that is part of why the setback for the storefront is 30, and then in the general, it's more so just a setback. Kind of a little bit more arbitrary of why the 20 foot. Because it's not necessarily for the active use, it's just to push back the parking. So it's not right on the street. And then we haven't talked about this drive-through building form much. Really, that's just in the case that we don't want to prohibit drive-throughs in this entire district. That would be a drive-through building type that would allow for a little bit more flexibility to have a drive-through lane, but as it's stated, it would not be permitted between the building and the street. So it would have to be a rear drive lane.
That's a really interesting. When you say drive-through, I'm thinking traditional like fast food drive-through, or is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's a radical idea. Why don't we just ban any further drive-throughs at all?
Anywhere in the city or anywhere in the district?
Anywhere in the district. Why do we want to?
They
At this point, I mean,
they are in the CBD effectively, but I would agree with you.
protect the existing ones. We don't want to put any Taco Bells out of business, for God's sake. But we don't want to encourage any more either.
It would have potentially, though, prevented your scraping and rebuilding of your Taco Bells.
Well, then that requires an amendment. But
I think that makes sense if we define where this code is taking effect. So if we define this district better, I think then that might fall into place very easily.
I think we should just be blatant about it. We don't want any more drive-thrus and whatever we designate the district or, yeah.
Sure, but I think the way this is written right now is that all of the transit-oriented overlay is part of this form-based code. Currently, as this draft is written, I know it's a draft, but that means all the drive-throughs that are currently on Woodward are now not conforming.
And if they burned down or you wanted to scrape it and redo it, you couldn't. So, and I know that was one of Michelle's things you wanted some guidance on, right? Was how or if to change underlying zoning or carve up more than one district.
Yes. So I would say
On drive-throughs in CBD, but
yes.
it just, where does this apply?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, other than the existing ones, and I don't know how to codify or make it right, my outcome would be, I don't want any drive-throughs anywhere in Ferndale. We got enough. There's nowhere I can think of you want to put a drive-through anything, other than what's already there. So how do we do that? And if they have to be scraped and rebuilt, they can scrape and rebuild because they have an existing drive-through, grandfather it, whatever.
I think Councilman Pollock has a question.
I don't care.
You're not the chair. Ooh.
We've got enough pharmacies. I don't think we need one. I can't think. Okay.
Yeah,
Fair
as they're currently
I am. Banks
Yeah.
come to mind.
as they're currently cited, there have been conversations about pharmacies and banks, and they've been strongly discouraged. I think if we felt strongly enough about it being a citywide issue, we should have a citywide discussion about land uses.
Yeah.
Because the conversations that then come up are, well, you won't let me put my drive-through at the CVS on West 9 Mile, so I'm going to buy something just on the other side of Pinecrest to do it. So
Okay.
But that's still Ferndale, and it's still
Right.
car-oriented, not pedestrian-oriented. So the conversations happen regularly. They want those drive-throughs.
My suggestion as an alternative to banning would be to identify certain locations where we would have, like Commissioner Casio suggested, a frontage type. So I don't have a good name for what that type would be because I wouldn't want to necessarily name it like auto-oriented or a drive-through, but something similar to that. And what I would recommend is have it on the blocks that already have existing drive-throughs. So there's actually only 5 blocks on the south end of Woodward that have those. And so we could just identify those, 5 blocks as that type of street frontage. And we allow the building form of a drive-through. But it also gives us, we can still dictate what that is going to look like. They would look different than what those existing buildings look like today. For instance, if we go back to, I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place. Your building height, there's still in the building form for the drive-through a minimum stories of 2. So you'd have a 2-story drive-through.
You'd have a Birmingham Tim Hortons.
Yeah, basically. So for the purposes of wanting to limit the drive-through building for myself, also limited that building height to 3. So having a building between 2 and a requirement between 2 and 3 really limits your development potential, which would limit the frequency of the drive-through frontage, I would believe. That could change. And then also your siting would dictate, that you would have you'd still have your build to requirements, and the same setbacks. And you would,
I see the wheels going.
You wouldn't have any parking or the drive-through maneuvering lanes between the building and the street. So they would look different, and we can still, this is something that's implemented in other cities such as, Denver, that has form-based codes and whatnot, that they just allow this as a flexibility, knowing that they need to allow for the form, but then they want to also make it look better and more contextual within the, neighborhood.
Restricting it in the way you suggested, would basically hold us steady in terms of the number of curb cuts, and that sort of, we wouldn't be reducing our overall curb cuts, which I know is a general goal in our main corridors.
Which is a safety issue, I would say, especially due to the angle of Woodward having, it makes it especially difficult for curb cuts on Woodward, which is an additional reason to limit the frequency of these types building forms.
I can just see, I think of the Royal Oak Starbucks that's got the drive-through in it, and it backs up Woodward's to high.
Yeah, it's awful.
It's awful. And there are lots I can foresee something like that trying to go in. That's what I'd like to stop.
How are we doing on time? I feel like we're all slightly running out of steam, so.
Okay. The only
Just
other
wanna
thing
check
that I would
in.
just take a look at, really only if you have suggestions on, you know, numbers. We're going to talk about, I mean, there's requirements for transparency. I would say that the design committee really liked the ideas that are put forth in the draft in terms of, it's a little bit more, it's requiring more than the existing, which they were happy with, as well as having more direction on how to implement it so that it meets, you know, the downtown character that we're looking for, especially for the storefront building type.
Was there any?
This is actually my last slide.
Oh,
Perfect. So I would say if you would please do your homework and just obviously go through, look at the different requirements. Things I didn't mention would be there's some alternatives. So if you have a build to alternative and a transparency alternative, and that just allows for some flexibility in the standards. And then what I think we didn't maybe talk about, but I think we're probably all on the same page, is keeping this as one district. I think now that we've kind of gone through the building forms and different frontage types, does that make sense to keep it as one district?
I think that.
Maybe marinate on it, or do we have?
My thought is that it seems to be that this commission has some issues with there being one district right now because there's no gradient between the CBD and the surrounding area, where there can be a building on Woodward that's 100 feet tall and a house right behind it. So maybe creating another district might allow some gradient and transition between a building that's 100 feet tall and a building that's 20 feet tall, 27 feet tall, whatever. So that's just my thought.
I think it's a good point.
Yeah, I think the two things that we've just talked about that need some level of differentiation are height and drive-throughs. So if it's a one-size-fits-all, how do we fit those?
So I would rephrase that as to not one district, but to minimize the number of districts, so it's functionally achieving our goals, right?
Or is it one district with clear, you know, like you had in the height incentive? Is it, you know, from this particular point you get this? So now it doesn't matter how this, whether it's an overlay or whether it's a change to the underlying zoning. Well, maybe it does, but you know, it can all be the same, but you've differentiated by location in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I would go ahead.
Just to the same point, I would say that the existing CBD has 4 different heights, so it kind of does it the same way. It's harder to do it. There's not enough reason, I don't think, to do it by district. If there's other reasons other than height that we want to do districts, I would agree. We can probably deal with height in a different way. So if that's the only reason, I would just make that point.
Yeah. So I was kind of looking for clarification. Sorry.
Oh, I didn't want to mean to.
You wanted to go? All right.
Sugaring.
As far as the district goes, and then these building types, is that what we're calling the different storefront, general, townhouse? How do those work? Like, I know you want to have storefront on 9 Mile. Are we essentially just having multiple districts? If you're saying there has to be, or are you just calling it by a different name? I guess if you're calling it a storefront on 9 Mile, but you can have general on Woodward. Like, how do those work, and where are they limited to or allowed? Do you know what I mean?
I would say storefronts required on the main street, and then
9 Mile is Main Street.
yes,
Okay.
basically.
And Woodward, because I mean those are the two.
Not and Woodward.
Not on Woodward.
We could change it. I mean, so we can make Main Street frontage wherever you think. So really, so it's a requirement to have the storefront.
Okay.
And which means you have more transparency and the required active use on the first
I'm familiar with like the type, but to me that feels like a district. I mean, it's called storefront as far as types. So I guess I was just looking for clarification.
It's basically a district.
Yeah.
So the only difference is then, if we have this auto-oriented, for lack of a better name, district to allow for the drive-through, and so basically you would say, well, on these blocks, this is that frontage type.
And you can always go from drive-through back to storefront, but you can't go from storefront to drive-through. Do you know what I mean?
So drive-through would only be permitted on that specific frontage, but any other type would be also allowed. I would say on page
I see what you're saying.
I'm
3.
just trying to figure out how they're different than districts.
Yep, on page 3, it makes maybe a little bit more sense if you look at the table. So it says the building forms down the left, and then it says the frontage type and where each is permitted or not permitted. So that says the drive-through would only be permitted on that auto-oriented frontage type. The storefronts only.
So those are essentially the districts, so like.
It's a
Yeah.
district, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The auto-oriented general and Main Street are the districts allowing, and that is the matrix showing the building type or building forms.
Yes. They're districts. It's just form-based codes.
Yeah.
You can go either way of having the district or
Right.
having the frontage type. It just makes more sense in my mind to have the frontage type, especially if it's this auto-oriented, because it could be kind of random. It's not like a kind of a district.
Okay.
We can do it. We can call it whatever we want. We can define them differently. So it's a good point to bring up that that is a difference, but it's basically the same. So there would be a map showing the same districts. Did it make it more confusing?
No.
Well, no, it just made it a little redundant, I think. Well, for me, like, are we layering things just in a different way?
It's a shell game to a degree.
I hope it's not shell game, but
If you can think of the zoning map, basically the whole district would be the one color, and then you'd have like a
overlays,
line along
essentially.
9 Mile saying this is the Main Street frontage, and then you'd have potentially this other frontage in different locations. If that makes more sense to think of it visually.
They're like sub-districts.
Yeah.
I think it's vocabulary at this point.
What's
Yeah,
that?
I think it's vocabulary.
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, is it like making a bunch of different overlays? Do you just make everything the same underneath and then?
So that was my next question.
Yeah, I was
Is this an
going
overlay or not?
Well, and what isn't an overlay on existing or on the clean slate of whatever we call the downtown or?
Right. So if we clean
Right
slate
now-
it,
Right now, we've got a mishmash.
then we have to include uses and parking, which can be easily done. We can kind of simplify it, or we can just maintain the existing. That's the biggest difference between leaving the underlying zoning and not.
I guess part of my thought on that is what will be easier to change and adapt in the future. Is it a lot easier for us internally to make a district and change the outline of that district if there's reason to do so? Or is it easier to rezone all of the CBD and some of the surrounding areas to this district? Which would be, I guess, easier for us to do?
I would say process-wise, it's the same. It's all going to be a
Okay.
rezoning. I would say the bigger difference, as I said, would be the uses. So then we would have to go through the process of, do these uses make sense? And it's just a bigger change. But we could even include uses and keep the underlying zoning. It would just kind of be redundant that way. There'd be no reason to keep the underlying zoning, but
We can talk more. Initially, I don't know that we've changed a lot of the
so when we talk about districts and uses, that's the other main difference. Is right now we have three, four different districts along Woodward, each allowing different uses. What this would do is have the same uses permitted in the entire district, with the exception of the Main Street frontage requiring an active use on the first floor. And then, you can change it by building form too. So obviously, the drive-through would be the only location where you could have a drive-through type of use. Other than that, your building form's dictating what's going on the land versus your use. So something to marinate on, I guess.
I had a question, and we've talked a lot about the 9 in Woodward sort of core node and how you know, plan around that. What about the 8 in Woodward and how we interact with? We draw a lot of maps in isolation from other states. Our intersection with Pleasant Ridge is a pretty clear, consistent. I mean, it's a seamless transition at this point. 8 in Woodward, not so much.
I probably couldn't point it out.
Yeah, right. So, in terms of the type of development that we would want to encourage there, is it consistent with what we'd be recommending up and down Woodward, or is it something different because it's sort of a gateway or a major transit transition, or something else? Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, that's sort of a standing question for me is, do we need a different treatment at 8 in Woodward because it's a major gateway and transition, or is it just the same as this?
I was also curious about the car dealerships and how that, when you're looking at required build-to of 75%, and for a drive-through. I was kind of curious how that works down there.
Yeah, they'd certainly not be in compliance now. Yeah.
I would say that people make it work in urban centers all over. So, I mean, it's just a big change. It is not consistent with how it is now, but it could be done.
Yeah.
So,
It wouldn't, again, be built the way it looks.
right. But I would say that if you go down there, you'll notice that those existing buildings, at least most of them, they are built 0-foot setback, and they are built, most of the, build to. They're older buildings, and that's how they were done back then. So if they could be done then, I don't see why not.
The new ones are 0 as well, even the one that they're still finishing right now. I think it's the maximum or the minimum, sorry.
Yeah. I was curious, I mean, some of those, if it took a really long lot that's not deep, then you're required to have this very long building, which I don't know how that functions or not, but just want to be cognizant of that concern down there.
Good point.
Other final thoughts or questions or direction for staff and consultants?
I would just add that if you do have anything to say, to me personally anyways, I will not be back in front of you, unfortunately. So I'm moving to Spain.
Oh, wow!
You're moving where?
To Spain.
Wow.
So
fantastic.
I will definitely take all of your, notes and
Cool.
everything, and I will be around for 3 more weeks. I just won't be around long enough to see you guys. But so I obviously will help Justin as much as possible before I leave and pass on all my knowledge and everything. But
So
yes,
exciting.
so unfortunately I can't take this to the finish line, but it's been a pleasure working on it. So
Oh my gosh, you've been a part of our team in so many ways for so long. Oh, so good. Congratulations.
Justin's already got my Skype information. So. Yes. So if there's nothing else, thank you so much.
Thank you. Any administrative items this evening?
Just quickly, the next meeting will hopefully introduce you to an intern and a sustainability planner, so that's exciting for us. And the next meeting is the 20th, 6:30, all about parking. So PUD public hearing notices were sent to probably the biggest mailing I've ever done, I think. So if people hadn't heard about it, I'm going to not believe them. But the goal would hopefully be to get some PUD approval that night. Obviously that depends on what we present to you guys, and hopefully can prove that case, and after that go to City Council. But plans are in review right now, looking pretty good. Very similar to what you guys have already seen, and then we're doing obviously the internal conversations with police and fire, and talking about stormwater management, all those types of things. So should be it's only one item, but I think it'll be a full night. I know Commissioner Gearing, he's already let me know he'll be absent. Haven't heard from anybody else, but let me know. Quorum would be very important that night.
I just wanted to point out that they're hiring a full-time and a part-time replacement.
Would not surprise me. All right, anything from the table? Okay, the meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a bug to put in your ear, Dan.
No, I mean it's
So
exactly what
after
we
the
Should we throw down about the ratio?
after the last
About the what?
conversation.